Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Nika Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What if Deku had multi-attribute quirk? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku was born with 6 circles on his chest. They surrounded his sternum, evenly spaced apart and forming a hexagon. It was linked to a quirk, that much was clear, though the hospital staff hadn't been able to decipher what kind. It wasn't the same as Inko's telekinesis, or Hisashi's fire breath. Neither of them had been born with marks imprinted on their skin. I wouldn't worry. Her doctor had told her, the corners of his old eyes crinkling with a warm smile. It doesn't seem to be hurting him. It's possible that he inherited one of his grandparents' quirks. Do you have any idea what those might be? Inko shook her head. Her parents' quirks had been similar to her own, and Hisashi had always been tight-lipped about whatever family he might have had before her. It was something she'd always found concerning, but never had the heart to question. Hisashi had wanted to leave the past behind him. Inko had respected his wishes. That's fine. The doctor had replied, noting something down on the clipboard balanced on his knee. It leaves a few blanks, but nothing to be concerned about. He'd reassured her. So what happens now? Inko had asked. Now, the two of you get some rest. He smiled. Then you'll be free to go home. When Inko said nothing, he continued. As for your son's quirk. Well, most quirks tend to come in when the child is 4 or 5, I imagine we won't get a clearer picture until then. Inko had still worried. It probably would have been more surprising if she hadn't, but it faded over time. Izuku was happy, and he seemed just fine whenever she saw him playing with the other kids. If it wasn't for the occasional glimpses she got of his mark, she might have forgotten her worry entirely. Hisashi had done his best to soothe her in those early years, repeating the doctor's reassurance in that steady voice of his as he hugged her, and Izuku, if one of them was holding him, close. In those moments, she was sure she'd never been more grateful to have him in her life. It was why, when only months after Izuku turned 3, she'd been caught off guard by the news that Hisashi's new promotion would mean he'd have to leave. They'd talked about it for hours, until long after the sun had set. Hisashi had made the arrangements, setting up a fund to support her and Izuku once they'd decided it wouldn't be a good idea to uproot him. He'd booked a couple of weeks off work, both to spend some time with them, and to familiarize himself with his new home once he'd arrived in America. She'd said goodbye to him at the airport, not even trying to hide her tears as she held him close, saying nothing when she felt his arms tighten around her in turn. Eventually though, he'd had to leave. Inko had returned to their apartment, Izuku clutching one of her hands with both of his, not quite old enough to understand why she was upset but still trying to offer comfort in that way all children did. Life continued, and as the days before Izuku's 4th birthday passed by, Inko felt that familiar worry stirring again. Mitsuki's boy had already developed his quirk, tiny sparks that exploded in the palm of his hand. Izuku had been fascinated, his eyes almost sparkling as he watched the other boy show it off. Compliments tumbled from his mouth while Katsuki grinned with pride. Inko had been worried at first. Quirks could be dangerous, especially in the hands of children who had yet to learn full control. The tiny sparks might not be dangerous now, but she knew they'd get bigger in time. Still, Izuku knew to be careful, and Inko saw the way Mitsuki's eyes slid over to the boys every so often. She let some of the tension bleed from her shoulders. Yes, the boys would be fine. Izuku's birthday came and went. Nothing happened. She'd been bracing herself for days, either in preparation for something to go wrong, or for her fears to finally be put to rest. And yet, nothing. It left her with a strange feeling in her chest later that night. She sat at the table in the kitchen after Izuku had gone to bed, after everything from the small celebration they'd had with the Bakugas and 1 or 2 of the neighbors' kids had been cleared away. She stared at the phone number the doctor had given her, wondering what she should do. Quirks didn't always come in on the child's birthday, that much she knew. Sometimes it took a little longer for their bodies to realize something was different, sometimes a quirk was subtle enough that it was only noticeable in specific situations. There were other things that led to a quirk manifestation, but Inko didn't like to think about those, not wanting to imagine Izuku experiencing something so horrible. Forced quirk activations were as rare as they were damaging. She shook the thought off quickly, frowning down at the surface of the table. She scooped the piece of paper with the number up and slid it back into her pocket. If Izuku didn't show any new signs by the time he was 5, then she'd call. She didn't want to waste the doctor's time if there was nothing to worry about. Izuku started having coughing fits a few days later. They started out small, gradually building into much longer, harsher fits that left his throat raw and his neck almost feverish to the touch. Inko kept a steady supply of cough drops in the apartment, fetching him glasses of water while she tried to ignore the panic building in her chest. She'd taken him to hospital after a particularly bad one left him struggling to breathe. They'd come home with some specialized medicine and a set of reusable cold packs. It didn't stop the coughing. A few weeks later, during a visit from the Bakugas, another coughing fit struck. Inko had begun to reach for a glass when something made her pause. When she turned to look at Izuku, she saw smoke billow from between his lips. In the next second, fire burst from his mouth. The first thing Inko did after ushering the Bakugas out, she'd felt bad about it, but Mitsuki and Masaru had understood, was rush Izuku to the nearest hospital. She probably should have made an appointment first, but that old, familiar panic only worsened at the thought of having to wait. Luckily the waiting room was mostly empty once they arrived, an unfortunate rarity nowadays. Villain attacks weren't as common as the media liked to portray, but Quirk accidents still happened, and that was without considering the various injuries and conditions that had still been prevalent long before Quirks came into existence. As such, there was never a shortage of hospital patients, as unfortunate as it was. The two of them were directed down a short corridor, and into the office of the Quirk counselor Inko had spoken to when Izuku's coughing fits and feverish neck had become too concerning to leave untreated. The man's lips tugged into a warm smile when he saw them, his eyes twinkling with amusement at Izuku's obvious excitement. "I take it you have good news for me?" Tsugawa asked, chuckling softly when Izuku nodded frantically. "Well then, hop up here and we'll see what we're dealing with," he instructed, patting the bed he was sitting next to. Quirk counselors didn't handle full checkups, but those first few times a person used their quirk could be exhausting, so their offices usually had a bed handy. Izuku scurried over to it, scrambling up to perch on the mattress. The earnest determination on his face was enough to make Inko smile, even with the anxiousness that had been coiling in her stomach since the second those flames had burst from his mouth. "Now, I know you've been asked all of these already, but there's some questions I need to ask before we get started," the counselor explained to her, quietly motioning to the empty chair across from him. Inko nodded, claiming the offered seat, and answered the questions as quickly as she could. Tsugawa made a note of her answers, clicking his pen once he'd filled the final necessary section on the form he was holding. Inko watched as he set it down before picking up a different, blank form from the small stack on his desk. "Now, I've been told you developed your quirk recently," he said to Izuku, the soft smile still tugging at his lips. "I bet that was exciting." Izuku was practically vibrating where he sat, once again nodding frantically as he visibly resisted the urge to start rambling. Tsugawa shot an amused glance in Inko's direction, brown eyes shining with endearment. "Would you mind telling me what it does?" he prodded gently, encouragingly. "I can breathe fire," Izuku answered after a brief moment of hesitation, his tone bashful despite the awe coating his words, as though he couldn't quite believe it was real. "Wow, that is impressive." Inko knew he'd most likely said the same line to many other children who'd come to him after their quirks first manifested, but the gentle reassurance was enough for Izuku to flash him a blinding smile. "Now, this room isn't exactly fireproof, so we'll have to go somewhere else to properly assess it," he explained calmly. "But right now I'm just going to fetch one of my colleagues to assist with a quick checkup, if you don't mind waiting." He directed the last part in her direction. Inko nodded her agreement and watched as he left the room. The checkup was fairly standard, as far as Inko could tell. They checked his throat and lungs, deeming them both to be in perfect condition, if a little warm from his earlier quirk activation. Feverishly warm skin is fairly common in those with fire quirks. The Dr. Tsugawa had returned with explained. On some level, Inko had already known that. Hisashi had the same quirk after all, their apartment was as fireproof as it could be for that exact reason. But Hisashi had never really used his quirk all that much around her. She could probably count on one hand the amount of times that he had, if she wanted to, and in her panic over Izuku's well-being she supposed she'd just forgotten. "I wouldn't worry at this stage, but do keep an eye on him if he falls ill," the doctor cautioned after giving her a moment to process his last comment. "Feverish heat caused by a quirk isn't the same as an actual fever. Keep an eye out for other symptoms and, if you're worried, bring him back here and we'll give him another checkup." "And the coughing?" Inko asked, wringing her hands in front of her. "This is the first time he's used his quirk, correct?" The doctor responded. Inko nodded. "In that case, it's probably just his body adjusting to his quirk. Once he's had time to get a handle on things, that should stop." Inko took a moment to note down everything she'd just been told. It wasn't anything that she found surprising, all things that she'd been planning on keeping an eye out for anyway, but writing it down helped ease her nerves. "There is one last thing," the doctor said once Inko had slid her pen back in her pocket. "The mark on Izuku's chest has changed." "It had?" The first thing Inko noticed when she stepped back into the room was that Izuku hadn't put his shirt back on yet. The second was the 6 circles on his chest. The doctor was right, Inko thought to herself as she claimed the seat closest to Izuku. Previously, the circles had all been black, as though he'd been born with a tattoo freshly inked on his skin, though, given the nature of some quirks, she supposed the possibility wasn't too out there. Now, the circle at the top of his sternum had morphed into a deep red. What does this mean? Inko asked, brow furrowing in confusion as she looked up at the doctor. If I had to guess, I'd say there's still some aspects to Izuku's quirk that haven't shown up yet. Inko reached out to clutch Izuku's hand reassuringly as the doctor spoke. Maybe he'll be able to manifest his flames in other ways, maybe he'll be able to do something entirely different. The doctor gave no visible signs of confusion, but Inko still heard it in his voice. I'm not going to lie, I haven't seen a case quite like your son's and there's a lot of things about quirks that we still don't know. But I highly doubt there's anything to worry about. His words weren't quite as calming as he probably hoped they'd be. So what should we do? She asked. Just keep doing what you have been doing, and if you notice anything concerning, come and see us. The doctor smiled. Now, would you like me to bring you back to Tsugawa for an initial quirk assessment, or would you rather schedule an appointment for another day? Inko took one look at the excited smile on Izuku's face and knew the decision had already been made. The room they were led to was mostly empty, containing only a simple chair and desk shoved into one corner. Even if Inko hadn't known what they were here for, the slightly singed walls and large air vents in the ceiling were enough of a clue. Inko followed the quirk counselor over to the desk while Izuku was directed to the X painted on the floor in the middle of the room. Now, we do have some screens in storage if you'd like us to grab one. Tsugawa offered as he set his clipboard down on the desk. Based on the information you've both given us about his quirk, we're far enough away for the flames to not reach us, so it shouldn't be necessary. But I know having the screen there can sometimes help ease the parents' minds if they're worried. Inko thought about it for a long moment, but eventually shook her head. Izuku's quirk was very similar to Hisashi's, at least, for the moment, she could handle it. If you're certain, the man trailed off, pausing briefly in case she changed her mind. She didn't. Then we can begin, if either of you need a break at any point just let us know. Distantly, she could just about make out the doctor saying the same thing to Izuku before walking over to join them. He'd be staying in case medical intervention was necessary, but Tsugawa would be the one leading the assessment. Izuku remained where he was in the middle of the room. Are you ready, Izuku? Tsugawa called out, his expression was serious but he still had that calm smile tugging at his lips. Izuku nodded frantically, his face momentarily concealed by a blur of green hair. Yes. He yelled back a moment later. Inko chuckled softly, aware of Tsugawa and the doctor doing the same on either side of her. Start whenever you like. Tsugawa told him. We'll go at your pace. Izuku was standing with his side facing them so Inko couldn't quite make out his facial expression, but she saw the determination settle around his shoulders. Izuku took a deep breath. Wisps of smoke spilled from his lips, the fire following only a brief moment later. The assessment was fairly simple, Inko mused to herself later when they'd returned home and Izuku had gone to have a quick nap in his room. With how recently the quirk had developed, there was a limit to the kinds of tests that could be done, so they'd have to wait the few weeks, or perhaps months, it would take for Izuku to gain better control before they could test out any ideas the counselor might have formed from that first session. The session itself had mostly just involved Izuku breathing flames at the wall, occasionally breaking out into one of the coughing fits they'd both grown so used to. The doctor had checked him out each time, shining a light in his mouth to check his throat and holding a hand to his chest to check his lungs and heart. Tsugawa had mentioned something about the doctor's quirk, but she couldn't remember what. Tsugawa had asked questions, timed how long Izuku could hold a stream for, and at one point he'd brought in a device that had been much too bulky to be a standard thermometer to record the highest temperature Izuku's flames could reach, for now. The whole day had left Izuku wrung out. He'd been coughing a little on the way home, though it had been nowhere near as bad as the fits he'd experienced leading up to his quirk's awakening, his throat dry and slightly irritated from using his quirk so much in such a short time frame. It had been necessary, she knew. But the croak in Izuku's voice as he'd said goodbye to Tsugawa at the end of the appointment had still sent a pang through her heart. Was she worrying too much? Maybe. But there were still factors about Izuku's quirk that were unknown, things that they wouldn't find out until they eventually showed themselves. The coughing fits he'd experienced before flames spilled from his lips had been troubling and, while the cause of them seemed obvious now, it didn't erase the stress of those few weeks. The coughing, as troubling as it had been at the time, was manageable. But her mind whirred with other possible side effects, things that wouldn't be so easily tempered by a glass of water. Inko closed her eyes, forced herself to take a deep breath. She was getting herself too worked up. Izuku hadn't even started showing any other side effects yet. He likely wouldn't for a while, but Inko knew that was just wishful thinking, that none of them had any real way of guessing when one would crop up. She sighed and reached across the kitchen table for her phone, dialing Mitsuki's number without looking. "Inko?" Her friend's voice crackled through the small phone speakers. Inko smiled. She could already feel some of the tension slipping from her shoulders. "Yes." She responded simply, tracing a tiny scratch on the table with her finger. "I meant to call you earlier," she added. They'd rushed out so suddenly that morning. Had it really just been a day? And she knew Mitsuki had understood, but she'd still wanted to explain, even if only a little. "I didn't think I'd hear from you before tomorrow," the other woman commented. "The first day is always the most challenging." Inko doubted that. With all the unknown surrounding Izuku, she knew there were a few more challenges lurking on the horizon. She didn't say that out loud though. Katsuki's quirk had already come in. Mitsuki wasn't clueless. "Maybe," she said instead. Some of her doubt slipped into her voice, but if Mitsuki caught it, she didn't say anything. "How is he, Izuku?" Mitsuki asked after a brief moment of silence. Her tone was brash, but Inko had known her long enough to hear the concern underneath. "Worn out," she hummed, voice steady despite her earlier worry. "But he's happy." Mitsuki laughed on the other end of the call. "I'll bet," she responded. "Quirks are his thing, aren't they?" Inko's lips curled into a fond smile. "They are," she agreed. The conversation drifted onto other topics after that, things that neither of them really cared about but helped. When the call finally ended and Inko set her phone back down, she felt much more at ease than she had for most of the day. The first thing the two of them did the next morning, after a quick breakfast, was call Hisashi. Originally Inko had planned to do it the night before, but Izuku had been too tired and she knew he wouldn't want to miss out, not with the nature of what they would be sharing with him. Hisashi had been smiling when his face flashed on the screen, that soft, patient smile that Inko had fallen in love with. His smile had stretched wider once the greetings were out of the way and Inko had given Izuku the all-clear to share his news, his small body vibrating with excitement. "I got my quirk." He beamed, his voice quiet as though he still couldn't quite believe it. "You did?" Hisashi's smile morphed into a grin as he leaned forward, eager. Izuku's energy was infectious even through a laptop screen it seemed. "Yeah." Izuku nodded, his voice a little louder, as though his father's acknowledgement was all it took to make the whole thing feel real. Inko would have perhaps been jealous if the sight wasn't so heartwarming. Izuku turned to look at her then, his head tilting with an unspoken question. Inko smiled. "It's okay, you can show him," she said. "Just be careful." Their apartment was as fireproof as it could be, but that didn't necessarily mean damage could be entirely avoided. Izuku nodded seriously, his small brows furrowing in concentration. He turned his head away, not doing anything until he was certain neither her or the screen would be in range. Inko heard Hisashi gasp when a small stream of fire slipped through Izuku's lips. He didn't hold it for long, he didn't need to, but a small cough still followed once the flames had stopped. Hisashi smiled sympathetically at the sound, his eyes shimmering with pride and understanding. "You'll get the hang of it," he said softly, Izuku's cheeks flushing slightly at the encouragement. Hisashi's gaze flicked to her momentarily before he said anything else. "Your mom told me you like writing about quirks?" Izuku nodded, his expression turning a touch shy. "Why don't you go and grab your notebook, I can give you a few tips." Izuku's head snapped up and Inko couldn't help a small laugh at how quickly he dashed to his room. "He's just like you were," she commented idly, smiling when Hisashi let out a soft chuckle. "He's like both of us," Hisashi countered warmly. They didn't have time to say anything else before Izuku returned, hurrying over with a notebook clutched in his hands. He scrambled back into his seat, flipped through the book for an empty page and grabbed the pencil he'd tucked behind his ear. Inko exchanged amused glances with Hisashi before leaning back in her seat, content to listen as Izuku shared the notes he'd already made, stumbling over a few words that he'd remembered the doctor and quirk counselor using. Hisashi listened intently, nodding along to Izuku's words as though the quirk was one he'd never heard of before and not at all similar to his own. Eventually, Izuku ran out of words to say, but he didn't close his notebook yet, instead looking back up at the screen to gauge his father's opinion. "You worked all of that out yourself?" Hisashi asked. Izuku shrugged. "I had help." Hisashi glanced at her then. "A lot of it is based on what the counselor told us," she said. "But the theories are all his." Izuku flushed slightly at the addition, though a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Impressive," Hisashi hummed. "You're becoming quite talented, Izuku." The sound the boy let out was close to a whine, and their amusement was mirrored in each other's faces as they shared a quick glance over the top of his head. Okay. Inko spoke up again, some of her amusement slipping into her voice. Stop teasing him, Hisashi. The man narrowed his eyes playfully at the comment, but he conceded. All right. He said slowly, feigning reluctance as he shifted his gaze back to Izuku. But I do mean it, Izuku, it's a good skill you have there. Izuku said nothing, but it was clear he was listening. You still want those tips? Izuku nodded frantically, hunching over his notebook ready to take notes. Hisashi spoke slowly to give Izuku time to write out whatever notes he wanted, telling him about what kind of things made the flames easier to manage, what to avoid and, after a hesitant glance in Inko's direction, how to make them stronger. Izuku wrote it all down eagerly, his mouth opening and closing with silent words. It wasn't long before Hisashi ran out things to tell him. Izuku had already guessed a few of them, so there hadn't been many pointers left for his father to mention. Izuku finished the sentence he was writing, then got up to return the notebook to his room. He'll be just fine. Hisashi smiled once he was gone. Inko wanted to agree, but they think there's more to his quirk, she said. The hospital. Hisashi frowned. More? He parroted. How do you mean? That's the thing, we don't know. She shrugged. There's a lot we still don't know. She paused for a moment as she tried to figure out how to phrase it. There's a chance that fire breathing is just a part of his quirk and not the full quirk itself. She settled on eventually. Would it be a problem if it was? Hisashi asked. What? If it turns out he can do more than breathe fire, would you have a problem with it? He leaned back in his seat on the screen, clasping his hands together in front of him. No, of course not. Inko denied immediately. But you can't blame me for worrying. And I'm not. Hisashi assured her. Any good parent would. He himself didn't look too concerned, but Inko had known him for long enough to know he must be, if only a little. He started seeing a quirk counselor and, most importantly, he has you. Hisashi continued, his words earnest. Izuku will be just fine. Inko hoped he was right. The kids at school had been impressed, Izuku told her the next day. They weren't technically allowed to use their quirks in public, but there was some leniency for young children who'd only recently gained theirs, if only because quirks tended to be weak enough at that age to not do too much damage. Inko still made sure to remind him of that, gently, because she remembered her own excitement when she was his age, but she knew her son, she knew he'd be careful, that he wouldn't make a regular habit of it. Katsuki was in the same class, so his lack of surprise when he visited a few days later wasn't shocking. He'd grumbled about how his quirk was still more impressive, but Inko caught the expression on his face when Izuku had asked for permission to practice in the apartment, excitement, followed by the grudging respect that was typical in young children when they saw something they didn't want to admit they found cool. Izuku practiced whenever he could, sometimes with Katsuki, but mostly on his own. He tried the things that Hisashi had recommended, foods which were meant to make the flames stronger. He didn't like all of it, and some of the spicier options were substituted for something much milder to help build his tolerance, breathing exercises to both increase how long he could hold a stream for and to help ease some of his coughing, among other things. He had regular appointments with Tsugawa every few weeks, the man showing an earnest interest in his progress every time they visited his office. He recommended some aerobic exercises for Izuku to try, things that would help improve his lungs alongside practicing his breathing. He also began to let them spend more time than what was strictly necessary in that room they used to assess his quirk. Izuku's quirk was noticeably getting stronger, and their apartment was only so big. It was a kind gesture that both of them appreciated. Hisashi called often, the man beaming with pride at every improvement they told him about, gushing over the videos Inko sent him, because, again, their apartment wasn't big enough to keep showing him over the call, and eagerly listening to Izuku's own analysis. He might not be there in person, and the calls weren't as regular as any of them would like, but he made sure they knew he cared. His coughing was slow to settle down, Inko had observed with some level of concern. The fits weren't quite enough to leave him struggling for air anymore, but they weren't gone completely. She'd known it wouldn't stop entirely, that, even if it was only a sign of his body adjusting for the time being, it would stick around and be triggered if he used his quirk too much, even as his lungs slowly improved. She knew it was normal, but it didn't keep her from worrying. The other kids in his class liked his quirk, she knew. She'd overheard it often enough in the conversations he had with Katsuki. Though they didn't understand why he didn't show it off, not quite old enough to understand the laws that governed when and where it was acceptable for quirks to be used, only that they believed it to be unfair. Inko wasn't oblivious. She knew that some kids got away with using their quirks in public either because they were weak enough to not damage anything, powerful or flashy enough, at least, one day they would be, to be deemed, heroic, or simply because the adults just didn't care enough to enforce it. Izuku wasn't one of them. His quirk was already powerful, and it would only get stronger in time, but he knew the law, as much as one his age could. He was passionate about quirks, so Inko hadn't been surprised when he'd walked up to her and asked questions about the laws that applied to them. A lot of the legal jargon had flown over his head, and he'd stumbled over unfamiliar words and tricky phrasing, but he'd understood enough of it. What was allowed and what wasn't, the consequences that would follow if the laws weren't followed. In that regard, Inko wasn't worried. No, instead her thoughts were occupied by something else. She stared at the calendar pinned against the wall, at the date creeping ever closer. The weeks leading up to Izuku's 5th birthday had Inko busy making preparations. She'd arranged for a few of Izuku's friends to come to their apartment after school to celebrate, she'd ordered a cake from the small bakery over in the next block, and she'd found the decorations she'd used last year. It wouldn't be much, but she knew Izuku would like it. She tugged him into a gentle hug the night before, her arms wrapping around his small frame. "I love you," she whispered into his hair, hoping he didn't notice the way her heart pounded. "I love you too," he chirped back, his arms wrapping around her in turn, clutching at the sides of her cardigan, not yet long enough to reach her back. She pressed a kiss against the top of his head, smiling when she heard him giggle. "Go on," she said as they separated, reaching up a hand to brush a few stray curls out of his face. He'd need a haircut soon. "Bedtime, you want to have some energy left for your party, don't you?" Izuku nodded and headed to his room. Inko watched him until she saw his door shut behind him. She heaved out a sigh a moment later, the worry showing on her face now that Izuku wasn't around to see it. It had almost been a whole year, and yet there had been no further hints at the true nature of his quirk. Perhaps someone else would have found that relieving, that there had been no new surprises. But Inko wasn't that person, and the more time that passed with no new developments only fueled her unease. Of course, there was no guarantee that a year would be enough time for some new aspect to make itself known. She had a feeling that something was going to happen, but she wasn't entirely sure when. Eventually deciding that there was nothing she could do but wait, Inko took a brief moment to double-check that she had Tsugawa's work number saved, despite the fact that she'd been in regular contact with him since that first appointment, and headed to bed herself. Whatever else there was left to do could be sorted tomorrow, while Izuku was still at school. Izuku's birthday came and went without issue. The party had been relatively small, their apartment not quite big enough for something more elaborate. Izuku hadn't minded, happy enough to spend time playing with Katsuki and their other friends while the adults talked quietly in the background. The kids had been halfway through another round of heroes versus villains when Inko had gently interrupted them. Any complaints they might have had were quelled when she mentioned it was time for cake. She couldn't help a quiet chuckle when she saw how quickly they hurried over to the kitchen. The cake was a nice red velvet that she knew Izuku liked, decorated with icing in All Might's colors and dotted with candles. The other kids sang happy birthday, even Katsuki, after some prodding, and Izuku was given the all-clear to blow the candles out. "Did you make a wish?" Inko asked, carefully picking the extinguished candles from the cake. "Yeah." Izuku beamed, smile stretching impossibly wider when she sliced the cake and slid one of the larger slices towards him. "Aren't you going to tell me what it is?" She teased lightly as she plated up slices for the other kids. Izuku shook his head. "It won't come true," he said, as though it was a fact. He was young enough that to him it was, she thought to herself with something hovering between fondness and amusement. Katsuki scoffed, but when Inko turned her gaze to him he nodded sagely in agreement. "Okay," she conceded with a soft chuckle, turning to place the knife in the sink to be cleaned later. "Enjoy your cake, then you can go back to playing for a few minutes." The kids didn't need telling twice. Inko started cleaning up once the other kids had gone home, leaving Izuku in the living room to open the few presents they'd brought for him. He'd already opened the ones from her that morning, and a slight postal delay meant that the one from Hisashi likely wouldn't arrive until tomorrow. It wasn't until later, when Izuku had gone to bed, that she realized no new side effects had appeared. She'd stared at her phone for a long time, contemplating whether or not it was worth calling Tsugawa before dismissing the idea. It had taken a few days for Izuku's coughing fits to appear, and weeks after that for flames to burst from his mouth, she reminded herself. She just had to be patient. Sure enough, a few days after his birthday had passed, Izuku told her that his legs hurt. She hadn't thought much of it at first, thinking it was just growing pains. Not fun to deal with, but ultimately nothing concerning. As the pain steadily worsened, she found herself doubting that initial assessment, booking an appointment at the hospital just to be sure it was nothing serious. A part of her was tempted to call Tsugawa, but, though she wasn't exactly an expert in the field, she knew enough to be aware that leg pain wasn't connected to Izuku's fire breathing, that whatever assistance Tsugawa could provide would be limited until this new aspect made itself known. They walked away from the appointment with a bottle of painkillers and a set of heat and cold packs. On some days the pain was manageable, a dull ache that Izuku found easy to ignore as long as he wasn't too active. On other days it left him in tears with Inko flitting nervously around him, applying heat or cold packs, whichever was more appropriate, to his joints and muscles, whispering quiet words into his hair as she held him close, waiting for the painkillers to kick in. Both of them were always left feeling wrung out on those days. It was almost enough to make her miss the days where they only had his coughing to worry about. Not because those fits had necessarily been easier, but because this new problem, if it was connected to his quirk, which Inko heavily suspected it was, painted a troubling picture of what the next few years of Izuku's life would look like. The pain always faded eventually, it rarely lasted longer than a day. But that knowledge did little to soothe Inko's concern. Her lunch break had only just started when she received the call from Izuku's school. She'd barely managed to remember to let her boss know that something had come up before practically running from the building and calling the number she'd saved for a taxi service on her phone. Her mind whirred with possibilities as they drove. She hadn't registered much of that phone call when she'd answered it, the words incident and Izuku replaying on a constant loop in her mind. She did her best to calm down, but she could tell by the look on the driver's face when he glanced at her through the rearview mirror that she wasn't doing a very good job. She asked him to wait once they reached the school, unbuckling her seatbelt and practically tearing the door off its hinges as she wrenched it open before hurrying out onto the schoolyard. A small crowd of students had gathered off to one side, Inko headed towards them, barely even noticing as they stepped back to clear a path for her once they'd realized who she was. She gasped when she saw the sight in front of her. The ground was cracked, jagged lines cutting through the concrete, radiating outwards from a single point. A teacher was crouched next to a person on the floor, and when she shifted Inko saw Izuku sitting roughly in the middle of it all. His legs were sprawled out in front of him, his feet resting in almost the exact center of the crack. His hands pressed against the floor, holding him up, and when he looked up at her his eyes were dazed. "Mom, I think my quirk just changed." His voice was a little shaky, but it didn't sound like he was hurt. Inko breathed a sigh of relief. Luckily for them, Tsugawa was already saying goodbye to another patient when they arrived. The man took one look at them and immediately ushered them into his office after instructing the receptionist to reschedule the next few he had lined up. Normally it wouldn't be that easy, but priority was given to those with quirks that were quite damaging, especially if it was the first time they'd actually used the quirk. "So, what seems to be the problem?" he'd asked once they were in the room, listening in silence as Inko told him about the incident she'd been called to. Izuku piped up occasionally with details she hadn't been there to see. His voice was a little shaky, but it seemed some of his awareness had returned. The quirk counselor wrote a few things down on the notepad clutched in his hand before leaving briefly to find a doctor for a quick examination. The process was much faster than it had been the first time they'd come to see him, though it wasn't quite enough to settle her nerves entirely. "I think we can safely say that this new aspect of your son's quirk isn't something we could have predicted," Tsugawa said once the doctor had led Izuku into a different room. Inko nodded in agreement as she thought about what this could mean. "What happens now?" she asked, idly fidgeting with her wedding ring as she stared at the door. "I can't say anything for certain until we've been able to test Izuku's quirk in a controlled environment," he said, copying his initial notes down on a blank form. "But, until we know more, I think it would be better to treat each new aspect of his quirk as a completely separate quirk." "But it's not, is it?" Inko asked. "Multiple quirks, I mean." Because, even though she wouldn't have a problem with it if that was the case, beyond the worries that came with being a parent, she wanted to be sure. "No, it's all the same quirk, I assure you." He flashed her a calm smile. "It's just that the quirk isn't what we first thought it was, and, while that can sometimes cause complications, I do not believe that it's a bad thing in this case." "He was in shock earlier," Inko said. "How do I know this won't hurt him in the future?" It already had been hurting him, the coughing, the pain in his legs. Sure, the effects hadn't been permanent and would no doubt become less frequent the more he adjusted to his power, but she couldn't quite shake the fear that one of these side effects would damage him irreparably. The chances of a person developing a quirk that actively harms them after their body has had the necessary time to adjust is very low. "It's not unheard of course, but I'm confident that Izuku will be fine," he responded. "You're not the first parent to express concerns over your child's quirk, and you will not be the last." "What about those times where it does?" she pushed. "In most cases, it tends to be one of two things," he replied, setting the paperwork down on his desk. "One being a birth defect that results in the child inheriting the quirk of one parent but the resistance from the other. For example, a child whose parents are able to create fire and ice respectively, might inherit the ability to create ice, but the resistance for fire. I think it's safe to say that's not an issue with Izuku. It wasn't, she could concede, but with how different his quirk was to both of theirs, well, the fire at least he had in common with Hisashi, but this new ability wasn't something her husband was capable of. And the other instance? Repeated quirk overuse within a relatively short time PRD. He answered. Quirk overuse can include both quirk exhaustion and using the maximum possible power output even after passing the body's physical limitations. He paused. The kind of damage that can cause varies depending on the nature of the quirk itself. But, it's unlikely that the average person will hit that limit often enough to cause permanent damage. But not impossible? No, but that's not necessarily something to worry about unless the individual in question pursues a lifestyle where they'll be using their quirk frequently. He explained. Heroics, of course, is the most notable example, but such fields require a level of training that will significantly improve upon the limitations that could cause them harm. I won't say that the risk is completely removed, but the amount of time the average hero spends in recovery due to quirk overuse is much lower than you'd think. He spared her a smile. Besides, that's a consideration for the future, not right now. Inko didn't have time to ask anything else before the door opened and the doctor called both of them into the room. He has a small scrape on his hand from falling, but, other than that, your boy's perfectly fine. Inko felt the tension leave her shoulders at the doctor's words. A relieved smile slipped onto her face as she claimed the seat next to the bed Izuku was still perched on. Anything new about his quirk? Tsugawa asked, flashing a grin in Izuku's direction which was enough to draw a laugh out of him. From what Izuku told me, I don't believe it would be wise to test the quirk on hospital grounds. The doctor said, continuing only when Tsugawa hummed in agreement. We can discuss our next steps regarding that once we've finished here. Did you notice anything about it? Inko asked, a touch of her previous concern entering her voice. The mark on your son's chest changed again. The doctor responded and, after a brief pause, gently asked Izuku to unfasten the first few buttons of his shirt. Inko leaned forward to see the mark. Her eyes first locked on the red circle just above his sternum, the one she'd got used to seeing. As she slid her gaze to the right, she saw that another one of the circles had changed color, the black having morphed into a dark orange. Each new aspect he unlocks seems to be signified by the circles on his chest, but I'm sure you'd figured that out already. The doctor said. With the timing of this new development, I'd say we'll be seeing the next one in roughly a year. But I can't guarantee it, and I don't know if there's any way of predicting what his next ability will be. The rest of the appointment was spent discussing how to handle Izuku's next quirk assessment, since both the quirk counselor and doctor had agreed that the hospital didn't have the facilities for it. An agreement was eventually reached and Inko was quick to get Izuku back home so he could finally get some rest. They arrived at the hospital early, taking a seat in the waiting room once the receptionist had asked them a few questions. The assessment itself would be done off-site, but it would be easier to meet up with Tsugawa here rather than trying to find the location he'd picked out on their own. They weren't kept waiting for long. Tsugawa had mentioned that he'd clear his schedule for the day, a common practice for off-site assessment, he'd told them, so they'd only been sitting there for the few minutes it took for him to find out about their arrival before he appeared and led them to a car bearing the name of the hospital on one of its doors parked outside. Now, I know going off-site can make things seem much scarier than they actually are. The man said as he climbed into the driver's seat, sparing the two of them a warm smile as he buckled his seat belt. But I want to reassure you that this is just standard procedure, Izuku will be just fine. It wasn't quite enough to soothe the ball of worry that had been building in Inko's chest since she woke up, but she appreciated the effort. The building they arrived at looked as though someone had fused a warehouse and small clinic together, one large box-like structure made of concrete and reinforced metal with a smaller one wedged against the side. Inko wasn't sure what to feel, but she was aware of Izuku fidgeting by her side, shaking with the restless energy that had been steadily building up during the car ride. Tsugawa led them to the smaller structure and into a slightly cramped reception area that was only really big enough for a desk and 3 chairs. We have an appointment for Izuku Midoriya, Tsugawa said, handing the receptionist the file he was carrying. The man made a few notes before asking Tsugawa and Inko some questions, the fin-like shape on top of his head swaying gently as he spoke. Izuku seemed fascinated by it, much to their shared amusement. The receptionist eventually motioned to a door behind him, waving them through as he handed the file back to Tsugawa. This room was bigger, with a bed against one wall and a locked cabinet of medical equipment forming a small infirmary. The doctor, Azuma, according to the badge clipped to her blouse, greeted them warmly before motioning Izuku over to the bed. I'm sure you're excited to get started. she said, mostly to Izuku, a friendly smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. But we need to do a quick checkup first, is that okay? She added, waiting patiently for his response. Izuku nodded seriously, well, as seriously as anyone his age could. Azuma exchanged a brief glance with Inko, and began once she was certain they were ready. The checkup had been quick, mostly focusing on Izuku's legs and back. Azuma had also briefly looked at the mark on his chest but hadn't had anything new to say about it. They were in the larger structure now. It was just one large empty room with a concrete floor, and when Inko looked up, she saw that the ceiling was made of the same reinforced metal she'd glimpsed outside with a safety net strung beneath it. This room is as secure as it can be, but it's not 100% foolproof. Azuma told her when she noticed what she was staring at. It's just a precaution. It wasn't the most relaxing thing to hear, but that didn't mean it wasn't reassuring. Tsugawa stood on her other side, going over his notes one more time. When he looked up, Inko knew it was time to start. How are you feeling, Izuku? Tsugawa called out. I'm okay. He shouted back from the middle of the room, laughing at the way his voice echoed around the empty space. Are you ready to start? Tsugawa called out again. Yes. The three of them shared a brief chuckle at the eager response. All right, Tsugawa said, the smile clear in his voice. Try using your quirk, take as long as you need. He instructed. Nothing happened at first, and Inko found herself holding her breath in anticipation. She wasn't sure how much time passed, only that it felt longer than a minute, when something did. They heard it first, the crumbling sound of cracking concrete echoing noisily around the room. The suddenness of it was enough to make Inko jolt. The movement she glimpsed out the corner of her eye was all she needed to know she wasn't the only one. Izuku stumbled, managing to right himself for only a second before losing his balance entirely, toppling to the floor. Izuku, are you alright? Tsugawa asked while Azuma hurried over. Inko was tempted to follow her, but ultimately decided not to just in case she ended up getting in the way. She watched as he quickly, and a little shakily, got back on his feet. Yeah, he responded, a little breathless but no less excited. Azuma was speaking to him now, but Inko couldn't hear what was being said. The doctor walked back over to them a moment later. It was just a small tumble, Azuma said once she'd reached them. He doesn't even have a scrape. She smiled. Do you want to continue, Izuku? Tsugawa called out after making a quick note. Yes. Izuku shouted back, his tone laced with determination. Tsugawa nodded in acknowledgement. Whenever you're ready then. The man responded with a smile. She was ready for it this time, so the sound of cracking concrete didn't make Inko jolt as badly. She still did a bit, but it was only because the sound was so loud in that empty room. Izuku still stumbled, but this time he didn't fall. Azuma gave him another checkup before they left, adding a note to his file about some new stiffness in his legs and commenting about setting up a training plan to help. She also brought up scheduling further appointments for Izuku to practice in a controlled environment but said they could discuss it later. Sorry about your floor, Tsugawa said as they stepped back into the reception area, an amused smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It hadn't taken long for a few cracks to turn into a smallish crater, one which Izuku had almost had to pull himself out of. Don't worry about it. Azuma shrugged, wearing a smile of her own. It'll be fixed by the end of the day. Did she know someone with a quirk that could do that, or did they have a machine for it? Inko wondered. It was the question Izuku would have probably asked if he wasn't currently snuggled tiredly against her side. They left not long after that. Tsugawa had to add the new information to Izuku's file and Inko had to get Izuku home. The quirk counselor gave them a ride, promising to contact Inko soon with a new plan before driving back to the hospital. Izuku went to have a nap as soon as they stepped into the apartment, and Inko settled in the living room to call Hisashi. Since the awakening had happened while he was at school, the other kids weren't quite as amazed by this new aspect of his quirk. They still thought it was cool, Izuku had told her as they walked home, which was understandable considering just how rare two-aspect quirks were, but the shock had had time to wear off. Katsuki had grumbled about it when he saw the new aspect for himself. He hadn't been there when it first manifested, but he'd heard about it afterwards. He'd been quick to insist that his quirk was still better, but the familiar declaration hadn't sounded as confident as it usually did. Trying to practice with this new power wasn't quite so easy. His flames had been manageable in the apartment, to a certain extent, but it wasn't an option now, not unless they wanted to risk having the ceiling drop on their heads or falling through into the apartment below. But that didn't mean there was nothing that could be done. Tsugawa arranged appointments at that more specialized testing ground every 2 weeks. Those time slots weren't quite as often as the ones he'd had for his fire, but it was better than nothing. The Quirk counselor had also recommended a couple of light exercises and other things to help improve his leg muscles and bones to ease the new side effects of his power. Izuku didn't train with his fire as much now. He still kept up with the breathing exercises, but he didn't practice with the flames themselves as often as he had the year before. He has excellent control, Tsugawa had said when she'd mentioned the observation to him. It's only reasonable that he'd turn his attention to the part he doesn't fully understand. It's an approach I agree with, if only so he doesn't overwhelm himself. Truthfully, Inko had already thought about that herself, but knowing that he agreed was still comforting. Hisashi's calls were as frequent as ever, and never tired of hearing Izuku talk about his quirk. His eyes were practically sparkling with excitement when Izuku told him he could do more than just breathe fire now. Inko always waited until the boy had gone to bed before discussing the appointments in more detail, knowing that Izuku would rather toss theories back and forth with his dad than listen to medical jargon he still didn't fully understand. The side effects he experienced from this new aspect of his quirk didn't make as much of an appearance as the last one did, though that was mostly because he had less time to practice it. Still, that didn't mean he didn't experience them at all, and it wasn't exactly uncommon for him to flop on the couch when they got back from an appointment, his legs, and sometimes his spine if he pushed it too far, aching from the combined efforts of using his quirk and then trudging up the stairs to their apartment. Still, the pain lessened each time. The kids at school didn't ask him to demonstrate his quirk as much now, partially because Izuku preferred to avoid using it in public if he wasn't sure he was allowed, and partially because a good chunk of them had already seen what this new aspect could do. It wasn't enough to stop them completely, but Izuku rarely humored them. A year passed by quickly and Izuku continued to make good progress with his quirk, much to the combined joy of Tsugawa and Azuma, who would be continuing to provide assistance while they still made use of the specialized facility, which was clear in every conversation they had with Inko. Things were going well enough that Inko barely even spared a thought to what could happen in a few months as she began the preparations for Izuku's 6th birthday. Of course, the concern wasn't gone entirely. Inko was a worrier by nature. It would have been strange if she wasn't feeling a vague sense of foreboding in some distant corner of her mind. But it was getting easier for her to ignore it, at least when it came to whatever new development Izuku's quirk would reveal. Instead, she directed her attention into planning, into digging out familiar decorations and ordering cake and presents. That nagging feeling in the corner of her mind was always easier to ignore when she had something to keep her busy. Izuku's birthday rolled around just as quickly as last time, but Inko felt none of the dread she'd experienced then. She still pulled him into a hug the night before, idly noting how much sturdier he felt in her arms this time. Inko knew kids grew up much too quickly, or at least, that's how it felt, but it was always different when it was your own child. His arms wrapped around her too, and she couldn't help a smile when she felt his hands clutch at the sides of her cardigan. He wasn't done growing yet, wouldn't be for a few more years yet. "I love you," she whispered into his hair, tilting her head to press a kiss against soft green curls. It was enough to make Izuku giggle. "I love you too," he responded as he always did, with a wide smile stretching across his face. Inko chuckled quietly, holding him tighter for a brief moment before letting go. "Go on, bedtime," she said softly, her eyes glinting knowingly. "Don't spend all night writing." Izuku groaned theatrically, but nodded in agreement, hurrying off to his room a moment later. Inko let out another quiet laugh, shaking her head fondly. She'd check on him in a few minutes just to be sure. She took a final look around the apartment, making sure that everything had been cleaned up and that the decorations were ready to be put up in the morning while Izuku was at school. She already knew that everything was as ready as it could be, but it gave her something to do while she waited for Mitsuki's phone call. Izuku's 6th birthday passed as easily as his 5th. An afternoon spent playing games with his friends. A few of the faces had been different this time, but Inko thought nothing of it, interrupted only when it was time to cut the cake, followed by a video call from Hisashi and opening presents once everyone had gone home. There had been no new signs of some other aspect of his quick showing up, but Inko didn't think about it too hard as she got to work cleaning up the mess that had been left behind. She was still a little worried, of course, she probably always would be, but the feeling wasn't anywhere near as intense as it was just 2 short years ago. Izuku started complaining about his eyes being sore a few days later. Inko had been calm as she'd tilted his head up to look for herself. His eyes had been painfully red, as though he'd spent a few days crying or not sleeping, neither of which were true. Inko would have known if he had. She dug out a pair of old sunglasses for him and shuttled them both out of the apartment and over to the hospital not long later. It was a good thing they'd already had an appointment scheduled. They returned with eye drops and a small bundle of masks. The eye drops weren't pleasant. Inko had seen Izuku's face scrunch up with displeasure at the sight of the bottle enough times by now to know that much, but the relief they offered was still enough to have him sitting as still as possible while Inko helped him apply them. The mask saw some use too. It wasn't that unusual for Inko to glance up from the novel she was reading to see Izuku tugging one, usually the red one, over his eyes as he flopped onto the empty seat beside her. The light didn't bother him too much, but she knew he found the feeling of the masks comforting on the days where his eyes had been particularly irritable. Still, as comforting as they were, the eye masks weren't exactly an option when he was at school, or anywhere other than their apartment, really. He always carried a pair of sunglasses with him now, tucking them in his pocket or shoving them in his bag before he headed out. She'd been sipping from a glass of water in the middle of the night when she heard the thump from Izuku's room. Inko hadn't thought much of it, merely sighing fondly to herself as she set her glass down on the kitchen counter and tugged her cardigan a little tighter around her shoulders. Izuku was a good kid, but he had a habit of staying up late into the night to write in his notebook when a new idea came to him. She didn't think this time would be any different. She shuffled out of the kitchen quietly, being careful not to make a sound as she approached Izuku's room. If he heard her coming, he'd have time to hide the evidence that he hadn't been sleeping, which sometimes encouraged him to stay up the next night as well. He never did 3 nights in a row. Inko knew the pattern by now. One wasn't so bad as long as he didn't do it too often, but she'd still check in on him to make sure he didn't go for 2. Sure enough, when she reached his door she could see light spilling out from under it. Inko smiled at the sight, shaking her head in fond exasperation as she slowly pushed it open. He was usually more sneaky than that, but it didn't really matter. "Izuku," she began, poking her head around the door to look at him. "You know you're not supposed to dash." She promptly cut herself off while she processed just what she was seeing. Just as Inko had expected, Izuku was sitting up in his bed. Unlike what she'd been expecting, he wasn't gazing at his notebook with a flashlight in hand. No. Instead he was staring at one of the posters on the wall directly in front of him, and the light wasn't coming from a flashlight. Inko couldn't even see one in his hand, but from his eyes. He turned to look at her, and Inko couldn't help a brief grimace as those twin beams of light met her eyes head-on, squinting as she tried to pick out Izuku's face behind them. Maybe she should also start keeping a pair of sunglasses on her at all times, she thought with some level of amusement. "Sorry," Izuku whispered, as though they weren't both already awake. "I don't know how to turn it off." Inko chuckled softly as she stepped further into the room, reaching up with one hand to block some of the light while she grabbed her phone with the other. It was too late in the night to call Tsugawa, but she could at least look up something that might help in the meantime. It took a couple of minutes, but they figured it out between them, and it wasn't long before Izuku was lying back down, a sleeping mask pulled over his eyes for extra reassurance. Inko paused for only a moment to run a hand through his hair before getting up and leaving the room. She should probably try and get back to sleep herself, but she wanted to at least send an email to Tsugawa first before she had the chance to forget. So instead of heading back to her room, her feet carried her to the living room where she kept her laptop. She didn't bother switching on the lamp in the corner of the room. It wouldn't take her long to do what she needed to, and there was enough light coming from the kitchen for her to see what she was doing. Inko headed to bed barely 5 minutes later, switching off the kitchen light as she went. The glass of water remained forgotten on the counter. It probably said something about just how many appointments they'd had with Tsugawa that he was already waiting for them next to the reception desk when they stepped through the door. He flashed them a kind smile before motioning for them to follow him into his office. The appointment itself was relatively straightforward. He asked them both some questions, had Izuku taken for a quick medical examination. The mark on his chest had changed again, one of the circles now a vibrant yellow, and then they were soon being led to a Quirk assessment room. It was different to the first one they used, smaller and lacking any windows. The lights hanging from the ceiling were dim and the walls were painted gray instead of the usual white. The walls used to be black. Tsugawa commented idly while he had a final glance over his notes. "Used to be?" Inko shifted her gaze over to him. Tsugawa reached up to the poster next to him, peeling up the corner to reveal a patch of bubbled wall hidden beneath. "Black paint made the room nice and dark, but it is also very good at absorbing light," he said. "Which normally isn't an issue since most light quirks I end up assessing don't start out very strong, but there are exceptions." He let the corner drop back into place, smoothing it down with one hand. "The damage was only surface level, thankfully, but we decided it was for the best to repaint the room before it could get worse." "So what happens now?" she asked. "As you've probably noticed, this room isn't exactly ideal for measuring the range of the light your boy's quirk produces. But we can still make some estimates, so I'm waiting for our specialist to arrive. It should only take a few minutes," he responded, fitting tinted lenses to the front of his glasses. "After that, it's just more of the standard procedure you're used to." He wasn't wrong, and the tests themselves were fairly straightforward. seeing how bright the light was and how long it could be held for before he had to stop. Interestingly, the light seemed to get dimmer the longer he held it for, calculating a rough estimate for how far it might be able to reach, and a brief test where they held up different material samples to see how his quirk behaved compared to a normal light. It was more or less the same. The post-assessment checkup hadn't taken too long, and Inko soon found herself back in Tsugawa's office, Izuku curled up against her side with one of his masks pulled over his eyes. The assessment had been relatively short compared to the others he'd had, but that didn't mean it hadn't been exhausting. "I'm afraid I don't have much advice for this new aspect of Izuku's quirk," Tsugawa told her, lips pursed thoughtfully as he ran a hand through graying hair. "There just aren't enough studies." "What does that mean?" Inko asked, fiddling with a loose thread on her cardigan. "To put things simply, think of a quirk as another muscle," he said. "The more you use it, the stronger it gets, provided you don't overdo it, that is. That's the case for a great deal of quirks. It's one of the first things we learn about the topic, right?" Inko nodded in agreement. "It's why oftentimes, the best way to improve a quirk is to pair using it frequently with exercises that work on the parts of the body the quirk is used with. Things like weightlifting to build muscle mass, which reduces the strain associated with strength-enhancing quirks, running to improve leg muscles, which helps make speed quirks more manageable. I could go on, but you get the idea. So, what's the issue here, exactly? The human eye can't be exercised in the same manner as other parts of the body. Adding a quirk on top of that makes it significantly trickier to suggest a regime. Eyes are more easily strained, combine that with quirk usage and the strain significantly worsens," he explained. "There's still so much about quirks that we just don't fully understand, and some quirk types in particular are under-researched. Quirks that affect the eyes are among those types." He paused briefly to allow her time to process his words. "When it comes to eye-based quirks, they can generally only be used in short bursts, the duration varying depending on how long the user is able to keep their eyes open without blinking," he said. "As such, training the ability is less about training specific muscles, and more about learning to handle the strain and discomfort." He clicked the pen he was holding. "Some consider that a good thing, others don't. I can't promise that this aspect of Izuku's quirk will be as powerful as the previous two we've covered, but I can say that, based on the information currently available about this subject, there shouldn't be as much training required." "And the strain?" she asked. "Is there anything that can be done about that? Other than the eye drops and masks you already have him using, there's not much else. You could try limiting his exposure to things that strain his eyes, but that's entirely up to the two of you to decide. The more he practices with his quirk, the more he'll get used to the discomfort," he responded. "It's not ideal, I know, but it's the only advice I can really give you until more studies are done." Izuku was quick to return to his room once they got back to their apartment, likely wanting to note all this new information down while it was still fresh in his mind. His eyes were still a little bloodshot, but enough of the sensitivity had faded for him to remove the mask in favor of his sunglasses. Inko decided to leave him to it. She had her own notes to make after all, and she'd have to call Hisashi to update him on the situation, but the latter part could wait until later in the evening, when she'd had time to process everything. She'd check on Izuku when it was time to eat. Tsugawa had been right when he said there wasn't much that could be done about this new part of Izuku's quirk. The previous two parts had involved roughly a year's worth of light training and assessments each, enough to get his body used to them and learn some fun tricks he could pull off when he wanted to, so long as he had permission first. But this time was different. Izuku still tried. Inko had lost count of the amount of times she'd caught him staring at nothing, going for as long as he could without blinking. A part of her was impressed by his determination, even if it was sometimes a little unnerving to see him do it when he was sitting down to eat his food. He used the eye drops when he needed to, which didn't happen as frequently as she'd initially expected, occasionally slipping on his sunglasses or mask when they weren't enough, whichever was more suitable at the time. He still had sessions with Tsugawa, but they were nowhere near as frequent as they had been with the previous two aspects. And, unlike before, the sessions mostly served as progress markers to see how much he'd improved. Of course, that part wasn't new, it had been a key part of the sessions for his previous aspects too, but the difference was that those sessions had also served to make adjustments to how Izuku used his quirk and to change up his training regime where necessary. There was none of that now. It was disappointing in a way, but Inko couldn't fault Tsugawa for it. The man had told her that there wasn't enough information available on the subject, and she was hardly an expert on the matter herself. But even so, Izuku was managing just fine, so she wasn't going to worry about it. Izuku's 7th birthday, just as the others had, seemed to arrive much too quickly. Inko wasn't sure whether that feeling stemmed from being a parent, or whether it was out of anticipation to see what his quirk this time. she wasn't sure. Perhaps it was some combination of both. Still, the day itself passed without incident and without the appearance of some new aspect. If the previous trend continued to hold true, Izuku wouldn't start showing any new side effects for at least a few days. Inko would keep an eye out, though she wasn't entirely sure just what to expect this time. No new side effects showed up. Perhaps that should have been a relief, a sign that Izuku's quirk had fully come in and that he could finally start focusing on perfecting the aspects he already had instead of having to adapt to a new one all over again. Inko wasn't that optimistic. Last time she checked, Izuku still had 3 circles on his chest that had yet to gain their color, which meant there were still 3 parts left for his quirk to manifest. The fact that neither of them really had any way of guessing just what the new aspect would be only made the whole thing more troubling. Even so, she was determined not to panic. Whichever new aspect Izuku got next would show up when it was ready, and who knows? Maybe the lack of noticeable side effects was a good sign. Inko had just been heading to the kitchen for a glass of water when she saw the shadow. She'd initially brushed it off as a trick of the light, her mind playing tricks on her by trying to make out shapes in the darkness. It was only when she flipped the switch on the wall, illuminating the room, that she realized it was real. "Izuku?" She called out hesitantly, quietly. Wordlessly, the shadow titled its head. Inko watched with bated breath as it pulled away from the wall, its shape warping yet still somehow managing to look like Izuku. It wasn't actually him, she didn't think, maybe it was his quirk? "What are you?" she asked softly. The shadow said nothing, either unable to speak or simply choosing not to. It slinked silently past Inko, barely paying her any mind as it walked further into the apartment. She couldn't even hear any footsteps. Not really knowing what else she should do, Inko followed quietly. Her own footsteps felt much too loud by comparison, but the shadow didn't seem bothered by her presence, not halting its movements until it was standing directly in front of Izuku's door. Inko watched as it slowly melted, for lack of a better term, almost appearing to seep into the floorboards before sliding through the gap beneath the door. Frowning in thought, Inko reached out to knock before slowly pushing it open. She saw the room light up as she stepped inside, knowing without looking that it was Izuku's bedside lamp and not his quirk. When she peered at him, she saw Izuku sitting up in bed, blinking blearily up at her as he wiped some grit from his eyes. The shadow had reformed in the time it had taken for her to enter the room. She saw it now sitting on the edge of the bed beside Izuku, its fingers tapping a soundless rhythm against the quilt. Izuku turned his head to see what she was looking at, and Inko struggled to resist the urge to laugh when she saw his eyes widen at the sight of his shadow sitting right next to him. The shadow turned to face him. Well, Inko assumed it did, the lack of facial features made it difficult to tell. It raised an arm with a small wave before slinking back into their surroundings, returning to its normal place. It was a strange thing to watch. Inko hadn't even noticed that Izuku hadn't been casting a shadow at all until the figure had melted away, but it at least seemed harmless enough. "Is that Izuku began, his words being cut off by a yawn. "Your quirk?" Inko finished for him, waiting for Izuku to nod before responding. "I think so, sweetheart." It looked like she'd be giving Tsugawa a call in the morning. Tsugawa said nothing for several long minutes once they'd finished explaining the most recent development to him. He gazed at them thoughtfully, the furrow in his brow getting deeper the longer the silence lasted. Eventually he sighed, the corners of his lips curling with a slight smile. "Have I ever told you that your quirk is by far the strangest I've ever worked with?" he asked. Inko let out a quiet chuckle and she could hear Izuku giggling by her side. Tsugawa shook his head in mock exasperation, but the smile had yet to leave his face, so they knew he wasn't being serious. "Right, I don't think I need to tell you what happens next, do I?" No, he didn't. One quick checkup later, Izuku's mark had changed again. One of the circles was now a deep purple, and they were led to an assessment room. It was similar to the one they'd used to test his light ability, though there were some noticeable differences. The walls were the usual white and the ceiling lights weren't as dim. The room also contained a number of seemingly random objects which Tsugawa was quick to explain. Some people with shadow manipulation quirks are able to influence other shadows, not just their own, he said as he walked around the room, shifting a few items to clear some space. Even if it turns out that Izuku isn't one of them, it's still worth testing. Besides, there's a chance he could gain that particular ability later on. "How high are the chances?" Inko asked, curious. "It's hard to say." Tsugawa shrugged. Shadow manipulation is one of the rarer quirks, and the side effects that stem from it are mostly unnoticeable, so it's difficult to pick up on the similarities, and that's without considering all the different types of abilities that fall under that category, he said. Besides, it's early days. The things Izuku can do with the individual aspects of his quirk might not end up being the full scope of his abilities, so I don't want to say anything for certain yet. Inko supposed that made sense. The assessment itself was fairly straightforward. Tsugawa had Izuku demonstrate what they'd told him about, watching as Izuku's shadow walked around the room and occasionally making notes. He asked Izuku to attempt to have it interact with the various objects in the room. Nothing it did seem to affect them. Try having it interact with the object's shadows instead, he suggested. Izuku didn't respond verbally, too busy concentrating, but he did spare the man a nod. His shadow approached a stack of boxes in the far corner of the room. Instead of focusing on the boxes themselves, Izuku focused on the shadows just barely visible from his position. His shadow reached forward, the shadow of the box on the very top of the pile moved. Izuku let out a quiet gasp, breaking his concentration. Since it hadn't been pulled away from the wall, the shadow of the box almost seemed to slide back into place while Izuku's shadow simply turned and walked back to him, melting back into its usual place once it was close enough for him to touch. Fascinating. Tsugawa smiled. I think that's enough for today. I'll schedule another session for next week and we'll see where things go from there. The shadow, which Izuku had taken to calling Kajiro, became a frequent presence around the apartment. Inko had grown used to rounding the corner to see it sitting in one of the dining room chairs, walking in aimless circles around rooms and even moving the shadows of the various things around the apartment while Izuku sat nearby, scribbling away in his notebook. She'd grown so used to it, that she hadn't thought to pre-warn Hisashi before one of his video calls. The sight of her usually calm husband almost falling out of his chair with a shriek, that he would later deny all knowledge of, when Kajiro appeared on the couch in the empty space on Izuku's other side was enough to have both mother and son breaking out into laughter while he pouted at them from the screen. Another memorable incident came when the Bakugas stopped by for a visit one afternoon. Again, Inko hadn't thought to pre-warn Mitsuki when she'd messaged asking if it was okay, and so when Kajiro's appearance was met with 3 yelps and a panicked explosion, she'd merely sighed and did her best to force down the smile threatening to stretch across her face. If the deadpan expression Mitsuki had directed at her was anything to go by, she hadn't been very successful. Thankfully, the shock hadn't taken too long to wear off. Mitsuki and Masaru had accepted the new reveal with a shared laugh and some light-hearted ribbing from the former for the lack of warning. Katsuki had scowled, shoving his hands in his pockets in an attempt to appear unbothered, huffing when his mother teased him about his reaction. Izuku did apologize for scaring them, but Katsuki merely rolled his eyes, grumbling about not being told sooner. His parents merely laughed again. The more Izuku practiced with Kajiro, the less he needed to actively concentrate to have it perform certain tasks. Before, it could only walk around at most if Izuku wasn't actively concentrating, but now it wasn't uncommon for Inko to sit down with Izuku to watch a movie only to turn around and see the shadow copying the actions of the actors on the screen, seemingly without any conscious instruction from Izuku. Kajiro also didn't always appear as a copy of Izuku. At some point he must have wondered if it would be possible for his shadow to take on a different form when it was in its physical state. The term wasn't entirely accurate, but neither of them knew any others that would fit, because Inko remembered the first time she'd stepped into the kitchen to see a shadow bird perched on the table in front of the seat Kajiro tended to occupy. It still appeared as Izuku most of the time, but it wasn't too uncommon to see it appear as some kind of animal and, on one particularly memorable occasion, a shadow copy of Hisashi stood in the middle of the living room. The man himself had merely smiled fondly when he was told about it later, promising to make an in-person visit as soon as his schedule cleared up. Izuku's hands start sweating in the summer. That alone wasn't anything unusual. It was always warm this time of year, almost unbearably so. Sometimes, you'd have a hard time finding anyone who wasn't. Of course there were the lucky ones who were born with quirks that made the heat manageable, ice quirks that helped them cool down, fire quirks that made them more tolerant of the heat, mutations that copied the characteristics of animals that thrived in warmer climates. The list went on. With all the abilities Izuku had gained in those 4, almost 5, short years, only one was temperature-based, and he didn't seem to be handling the summer any better than he usually did. That's not to say he didn't handle summer well, because he did, but that didn't mean he was immune to sweating when the weather was warm enough. So no, Inko hadn't thought anything was amiss. Then the sweating got worse. What started out with Izuku occasionally wiping his hands on his shorts, gradually worsened until he was walking around the apartment with a small hand towel tucked away in his pocket. On one memorable occasion, he'd pushed himself away from the table and left behind an almost perfect, watery handprint. Inko was a little concerned, but she'd been getting better at not worrying about every little thing over the past few years. Before, she might have called Tsugawa in a panic and rushed Izuku to the hospital for a checkup once the sweating had reached levels that would normally be troubling. Instead she simply sent the quirk counselor an email about what she highly suspected to be the signs of some new aspect of Izuku's quirk finally showing itself. It was earlier than the others had been. He hadn't even had his birthday yet, and was pleasantly surprised to find she was already following the advice he responded with. The new aspect came in fully on the morning of Izuku's 8th birthday. "So, what are we dealing with today?" Tsugawa asked, the three of them once again gathered in his office. "I emailed you about the sweating a few days ago," Inko reminded him. Tsugawa nodded. "You did, yes." He smiled. "I see we were right about it having something to do with Izuku's quirk." Inko allowed herself a brief chuckle before she began her explanation, telling him about how Izuku had gone to wash his hands that morning only to call for her a few minutes later. "I thought it was just the tap running," she said. "But when I went in," she trailed off, motioning to Izuku whose hands were still slightly dripping. "I see." Tsugawa hummed thoughtfully. "Well, we all know what the next step is, I hope." Neither Inko nor Izuku said anything, but they both wore matching smiles. Izuku's mark had changed again, one of the circles now a light blue. There was only one left that had yet to change color, and Inko felt a brief flare of relief at the thought that these surprises would stop soon. Once the checkup was done, Tsugawa led them to an assessment room. It was the same one they'd been brought to when the fire aspect of Izuku's quirk manifested only a few short years ago, though it sometimes felt like it had much longer than that. "All right Izuku, can you stand in the middle of the room for me?" Tsugawa said. "But don't do anything until I give you the all clear." The instruction wasn't really necessary, they'd been doing this often enough by now that they all knew the protocol, but Inko supposed he had to say it anyway just to be sure. Izuku said nothing, giving the man a quick, determined nod before hurrying over to his position. He was trying his best to hide it, but the slight tremor in his arms was enough to give away his excitement. Inko couldn't help but smile at the sight. "You've probably already noticed that we're in a familiar room," Tsugawa commented. "What you likely didn't notice last time was the vents built into the floor." Inko glanced down, not seeing anything at first. She looked harder, scanning the floor for anything she might have missed. It was then that she noticed the seams, a grid pattern, that she'd previously believed to be a simple floor design, spanning the entire room. "There's a water tank directly beneath this room in case of fires," Tsugawa explained. "The hospital has a more sophisticated system for the rest of the building, and this room in particular is, of course, designed to be as fireproof as possible, but some fire quirks are particularly powerful." Inko watched as the man reached below the table. At first she wasn't sure what he was after, but there must have been some kind of switch she couldn't see because the next thing she knew was that some of the floor panels had lowered, most likely opening up the drains leading to the water tank he'd mentioned. "We usually only keep the tank half full," Tsugawa continued. "Any fires that do manage to occur in this room are pretty rare, and relatively easy to control. Besides, it's useful for people with water quirks too, we have somewhere to drain all the excess without needing a separate room." Inko merely hummed in acknowledgement, it did make sense. The assessment itself had also been pretty similar to the ones they'd carried out when Izuku's fire aspect had manifested, testing how far he could shoot the water and making note of a rough baseline of how much he could produce in one go. "It's a fairly standard water quirk," Tsugawa said once they were done, his voice carrying a hint of amusement at using the term standard in relation to Izuku's quirk. "The water is secreted from pores in his hands, much like normal sweat." "Is there anything we should know going forward?" Inko asked. "Anything that we need to keep an eye on? I'd be careful not to let him get too dehydrated, especially while he's still learning how to use it," Tsugawa answered. "But beyond that, just keep doing what you have been doing." They talked for a few more minutes to hash out a few details before it was finally time for them to go home. Tsugawa quietly handed Izuku a bottle of flavored water just before they left the room, making the boy smile. Inko shook her head fondly at the sight. The water aspect of Izuku's quirk was one of the easier ones to learn. He could only really use it in the bathroom without having to worry about flooding the apartment, and while the size of the room prevented him from testing out all the things he wanted to, it was still easier to handle than his earth aspect had been. Inko had lost count of the amount of times she'd seen him standing over the bathtub, holding his hands out and trying to fill it just to see how much water his quirk could produce at once. His upper limit had been improving steadily and, while it probably wasn't the most exciting use of the new aspect, he always seemed happy with the results. Still, that didn't mean he never got the chance to test it out more thoroughly. Tsugawa was happy enough to keep arranging assessment sessions for Izuku to improve the new aspect in other ways. Sometimes they focused on trying to increase just how far he could shoot the water, and sometimes they experimented with adjusting the pressure, switching between a steady stream and a water jet capable of knocking down some stacked items. As for the dehydration problem, Inko had taken to buying a few packs of bottled water whenever she went shopping. Sure, Tap water did just fine, but it was useful having the extra bottles on standby just in case. She also made sure to put 2 in Izuku's bag before he left for school. He didn't use his quirk in public without permission like so many other kids his age still sometimes did, but it was occasionally triggered unintentionally, a side effect of the way his quirk was manifesting. That year was relatively uneventful. Hisashi had called a few times, expressing the same interest and excitement he'd always shown when it came to Izuku's quirk. He asked questions, some that the boy already had answers for, and others that he'd been quick to note down to research ready for next time. Some of it still flew over Inko's head, but she'd been to enough quirk assessment appointments by that point that she could follow along with most of it. Quirk analysis wasn't exactly one of her passions, but their enthusiasm could be infectious sometimes. It was only after the 3rd call had ended that Inko realized she hadn't seen any new signs. Izuku still had 1 circle left on his chest that had yet to change color, which meant that there was one last aspect of his quirk that had yet to show itself. But Inko hadn't seen anything that indicated his body was preparing itself for a new aspect, never mind anything that might determine just what that new power could be. It was strange, and yet, weirdly enough, Inko wasn't worried. She might have been in those first couple of years when the various aspects of Izuku's quirk first started showing themselves, back when it was causing him discomfort and, at times, hurting him. She might have wondered why nothing was happening, might have been working herself up into a state worrying over what-ifs and bracing herself for when the new aspect finally showed itself. But that was then. Now? They'd both been dealing with it for long enough that she merely focused her attention on helping him with the aspects he already had, double-checking that they had enough supplies stored away to deal with the occasional bouts of quirk exhaustion he still sometimes experienced, and following the suggestions that Tsugawa sometimes emailed her about between sessions. Besides, this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. There hadn't been any warning signs leading up to Kajiro's manifestation, at least, not any that Inko could remember, and that part of Izuku's quirk had come in just fine. Maybe this time would be similar? Whatever the case may be, there was no point in worrying over something that hadn't happened yet. All she could really do was keep an eye out. She noticed a strange breeze in the apartment a few days later. She didn't think much of it at first. The air conditioning in their apartment wasn't always the best, and they always had the occasional draft in the colder seasons. So no, she didn't really pay it much mind. It wasn't until she'd gone to rest her hand on Izuku's shoulder, a few days after his 9th birthday, that she noticed the back of his shirt was moving. It was subtle enough that she probably wouldn't have noticed it at all if she hadn't been paying attention, and she probably would have thought it was the air conditioning causing it if not for the slight chill she could feel coming from beneath his shirt collar. She craned her neck slightly to look at the back of his head just to make sure she wasn't imagining it, and smiled when she saw some of his hair moving in the breeze. Izuku stared up at her curiously, but said nothing. It seemed he hadn't noticed. Inko let her smile stretch a little wider and gently squeezed his shoulder. "Come and eat your food," she told him, tilting her head slightly to gesture at the table. "Then I think it's time we gave Tsugawa another call." Izuku's head shot up, his confusion quickly morphing into excitement. He hurried over to the table, tucking into his food at a speed that Inko would normally chastise him about, but this time chose not to. He'd been excited each time some new aspect had shown itself, but there was something different about it this time, something more intense. Maybe it was because it was the last one he'd been waiting for, she mused. Her own quirk, as was the case for most people, manifested all at once, so she couldn't really relate to how it felt to have some new part awaken year after year. Maybe she would have been the same in his shoes. She supposed it didn't matter. Izuku was happy, and that was all she really cared about. The initial medical assessment passed without issue. Izuku's mark had changed again, the final circle now a vibrant green. He beamed up at her when they saw it, and Inko couldn't help but tear up slightly at just how far he'd come. Tsugawa had given them a moment, dragging the discussion with Izuku's nurse out a little longer than he needed to. They didn't really need the extra time, but it was a kind gesture all the same. He led them up a long flight of stairs a short while later. It was only when he'd pushed open the door at the very top that Inko realized he'd brought them to the roof. Wind quirks are difficult to properly assess in enclosed environments, Tsugawa explained, shutting the door behind them. Even if we were to leave the windows open, the results likely wouldn't be a true reflection of just what it is we're working with this time. So you brought us to the roof, Inko observed, still a little out of breath from all the stairs. Tsugawa flashed her an apologetic smile. It was either this or the courtyard, he said. The courtyard sees frequent use during the day. It wouldn't be wise to test out a quirk of this nature so close to patients and staff. I do suppose we could have temporarily blocked access to it, but that's an option we try to avoid where possible. Besides, wind quirks are sometimes known for causing windows to shatter. it's for the best that we determine how high that risk is with Izuku before we consider taking this to the courtyard. Inko supposed that made sense. And you're sure this is safe? She might not worry as much about matters relating to Izuku's quirk as she used to, but that didn't make the idea of testing out a new, untrained aspect of his quirk on top of a roof of all things any less unnerving. See for yourself. Tsugawa said, sweeping his arm around the space. The roof was enclosed by 2 sets of tall fences, a barred one fixed around the edge of the roof and a chain link one further in. A net was stretched over the top, and if Inko squinted she could see it shimmering faintly in the daylight. All 3 are made from quirk-reinforced materials and are checked regularly. You'd need to be actively trying to break through them to get out. He smiled. Still, if it makes you feel better, we won't get too close to them. Inko breathed a quiet sigh. Tsugawa directed Izuku to the circle that had been drawn roughly in the middle of the roof, made a final note in the file he'd brought with him and tucked it securely under his arm. It was time to begin. Learning how to use this new part of his quirk wasn't as easy as learning to use the fire and water had been. The air seemed to stem from around his shoulder blades, making it harder to direct the wind where he wanted it to go since he had to curve it around his shoulders first. They kept at it for a few more sessions, with varying levels of success, before Tsugawa suggested they try something else. Try directing the wind at the floor this time, he'd said, gazing at Izuku thoughtfully. They were in the courtyard this time. The doors leading into it had notices stuck to them to keep anyone else out for the duration of the assessment. Inko had been curious when she'd seen them, remembering his earlier words about how it was something they tried to avoid. The instruction he'd just given made things much clearer. Izuku took a deep breath from where he stood, far enough away that Inko and Tsugawa wouldn't be knocked down by the wind, his shoulders raising and falling with the action. Inko felt a light breeze against her ankles a second later, keeping her eyes fixed on Izuku's form as he concentrated. Nothing happened at first. Izuku kept trying. He kept at it for a couple more minutes until eventually he began to rise, his entire body slowly lifting off the ground. He didn't make it very far before his concentration broke and he dropped back down, landing softly on his feet. Izuku whirled around, flashing the 2 of them a wide grin that Inko mirrored back to him proudly. Her boy could float. That became the focus of their next few sessions. Izuku was able to hover just fine once he'd got the hang of it, though it took more concentration the higher up he went, and he couldn't hold it for long either. He couldn't move much once he was actually in the air right now, but Tsugawa had been fairly confident in his prediction that Izuku would be able to fly once he'd had more practice controlling his own airflow. You certainly have quite the interesting combination of quirks, Tsugawa said to Izuku after yet another one of their sessions. The boy had grinned up at him and Inko hadn't been able to resist a small smile of her own. Her boy was 12 now, and he hadn't had any new surprise aspects show up for 3 years. Inko remembered watching him in those first few months after he'd turned 10, sometimes holding her breath in anticipation. Nothing had happened that year, or the next. Truthfully, she hadn't been expecting anything to happen. The mark on his chest was fully formed. But after 6 years of near-constant revelations, she could hardly be blamed for bracing herself for more. You've made good progress over these years, Tsugawa commented. Both of you, he added, a little bit of humor slipping into his tone when he addressed Inko. She huffed out a brief laugh in response, shaking her head in amusement. You mentioned wanting to discuss something with us, Inko reminded him, folding her hands together and resting them on top of her lap. Right, Tsugawa hummed. Like I said, Izuku has been making tremendous progress with his quirk. As such, I believe that it is no longer necessary for us to schedule regular assessments for him. He paused for a moment to allow them to process the news. I will, of course, still help you arrange appointments for him as and when necessary, but I believe he has a firm enough grasp on his abilities as things stand to not need these sessions as frequently. You think he's ready? Inko asked. It wasn't that she doubted Izuku's capability, she didn't, but they'd been attending these sessions for long enough now that the thought of them stopping was almost bizarre. I'm certain. Tsugawa smiled. We've been rotating between each of his aspects for 2 years now to make sure there haven't been any sudden changes, and to ensure that he remains familiar with them all. His smile stretched a little wider. Any further improvements and I may be accused of trying to get him into a hero school before he's old enough. Izuku perked up in his seat at the comment. Inko glimpsed the movement out the corner of her eye and let out a quiet chuckle. They talked for a few more minutes, discussing how their new arrangement would work before it was time for them to leave. Inko and Izuku stood up to head out once their appointment had come to an end. Inko had just been about to thank Tsugawa for all his help over the years when Izuku shot forward, wrapping his arms awkwardly around the man in a brief hug. Thank you, Uncle Tsugawa. The man blinked down at him in shock, caught off guard by his words. He recovered quickly and reached out a hand to gently pat the top of Izuku's head. "You're very welcome," he said with a smile. Inko couldn't resist one of her own. "Do you have everything?" Izuku paused, halfway through putting his shoes on as he went over the list again in his mind. Cough drops, check. Water, check. Cold and heat packs, check. Sunglasses, check. Eye drops, check. Sleep mask, check. Hand towel, check. It was an extensive list, and some people would probably find it concerning, but he had a decent enough level of control over his quirk by now that some of the items were rarely used. Still, it was better to have them on hand just in case, especially today. "Yeah." He nodded, giving his mom a quick smile. She returned it easily, eyes shining with a mixture of pride and some other emotion he couldn't name. "Go on then, you don't want to keep Katsuki waiting," she said. "There'll be a treat waiting for you when you get back." A more curious part of him wanted to ask about it, but she was right, Kaken wouldn't be happy if they were late. "What took you so long?" Kaken growled once he was close enough, hands shoved in his pockets and wearing his usual scowl. Izuku smiled. "I was just making sure I had everything," he said, smile stretching a little wider when Kaken merely scoffed. "The written exam doesn't start for a few more hours yet, we won't be late." "We would have been if you took any longer, DMN nerd." Kaken snapped, turning to head in the direction of the train station. Izuku followed with an amused grin, choosing not to mention that the other boy hadn't had to wait for him. UA was much bigger in person. Of course, he'd always known it would be. It was the most prestigious hero school in Japan and it hadn't exactly looked small in any of the pictures or videos he'd seen of it over the years. But there was something very different about standing in front of those gates personally, it was almost intimidating, unreal. A hand thumped against his shoulder, breaking him out of his musings. "Quit daydreaming." Kaken snapped, giving his shoulder another thump just to be sure. "If you fail because you were too busy getting lost in your head, I won't let you live it down." That was probably the closest thing to encouragement that the other boy could manage. Izuku merely flashed him a sheepish smile and carried on walking. He tripped on a loose bit of pavement barely a second later and was quick to brace for impact. It didn't come. He felt a much gentler hand press against his back and the next thing he knew he was just floating. "Sorry." A kind voice apologized. When he lifted his head he saw a girl with brown hair and a soft smile standing next to him, scratching the back of her head sheepishly. "I used my quirk, falling right before an exam seemed like bad luck," she explained, releasing her quirk, telekinesis? Gravity manipulation? As she spoke. "It's okay." Izuku responded, ignoring Kaken's snickering. "Thank you." The girl beamed. "Well, I guess I'll see you inside," she said, raising her hand with a small wave. "Bye." With that, she turned and continued walking towards the building. "Smooth." Kaken snorted once she was out of earshot. "Shut up." Izuku groaned, burying his face in his hands. Kaken did not, in fact, shut up. They were handed cards with their applicant numbers printed on them as soon as they stepped through the front doors, being directed to different classrooms alongside students from various other schools. Izuku didn't see anyone else from Aldera, but he figured that didn't really mean much. The first portion of the exam was reasonably straightforward. A written test designed to assess their base knowledge on heroics and quirks as a whole, followed by a small series of hypothetical scenarios and one final essay-style question which had Izuku requesting 2 extra sheets of paper in order to answer. It was all fairly simple, but still managed to be appropriately challenging. The brief, despairing groan he heard coming from one of the back corners of the room made it clear that not everyone felt the same. He regrouped. With Kaken once the written portion ended, the two of them walking in near silence to the briefing that would be explaining everything they needed to know about the practical exam. A lot of the others were the same, Izuku noticed, a few people attempted to speak with each other but the conversations all seemed to fade out before they could properly start. He could almost feel the excitement and apprehension in the air, his own nerves making his heart beat rapidly in his chest. Present Mike stood at the front of the auditorium. Present Mike. Sure, it was common knowledge that UA was staffed almost entirely by pro heroes, as was the case with most other hero schools, so having one standing in front of them right now shouldn't be surprising. But there was a big difference between knowing they were there and actually seeing one of them in person. Izuku knew he wasn't the only one brimming with excitement. "You there?" He was the only one to get called on it though. He shrunk back slightly as a stern-faced boy whirled round to face him, the same one who had been relentlessly firing off questions about the exam once Present Mike had finished the initial explanation. Kaken nudged his side once the boy had sat back down, making a show of rolling his eyes. Izuku merely shrugged. Once the briefing had ended they were led to the buses parked outside, Present Mike instructing them to head to the bus marked with the same number printed on their cards. Izuku and Kaken split ways again. They wouldn't know how well the other had done until it was all over. Izuku didn't notice who else was in his group until they were all gathered in front of the gates to one of UA's mock cities. He only recognized two, the brown-haired girl he'd met before the written exam and the stern-faced boy who'd called him out during the briefing. He idly wondered how they'd do, not having a lot of time to think before Present Mike was calling for their attention again. There was no countdown, only the sound of the gates swinging open and the hero's voice yelling for them to start. Izuku took a deep breath, feet thudding against the concrete as he hurried inside with the rest of the examinees. Plus ultra indeed. The robots were on them almost as soon as they entered the exam area, metal frames and plate armor glinting in the sunlight. Flashing red eyes locked on them as soon as they were through the doors. It was pretty clear that this wasn't going to be easy. Izuku had known it wouldn't be. There was an explosion of noise as the robots' weapon systems started firing, the sound of the other applicants' quirks joining not long afterwards, many of them charging ahead to snag a few early points. Izuku wasn't one of them. Instead, he made a sharp turn and dashed away from the group, running towards one of the taller buildings lining the street. He felt the wind coil around his shoulders and launched himself into the air, landing a little clumsily on the roof. Hopefully that would buy him enough time to think. He'd already had a basic plan forming in his mind while Present Mike had been explaining the nature of the exam to them, but he'd wanted to observe the robots in action before he fully committed to anything. Rushing in blindly would be unwise, but he also knew that whatever shape his plan took would have to be flexible enough to allow for some improvisation. Izuku's quirk was a bit of a double-edged sword. It was powerful, there was no denying that. Each individual aspect of his quirk had their uses, not all of them were directly combat-focused, though that didn't mean they didn't still have their uses in a fight, but he didn't need them to be. 2-part quirks were rare and highly sought after for their versatility, 6-part quirks were practically unheard of. The very idea of someone having a quirk like that was often brushed off as little more than the work of fiction. So yes, Izuku knew his quirk was strong. However, all quirks had their drawbacks. For Izuku, that drawback was obvious. A 6-part quirk meant that he could only use each aspect for a sixth of the time as someone whose quirk only had one part. The most blatant comparison in his mind would be between him and his dad. Hisashi would always be able to breathe fire for longer than Izuku even if they had the same amount of time to build up their endurance. It wasn't that Izuku was weaker, it was just that fire breathing only made up a small part of his quirk, unlike Hisashi whose entire quirk was fire breathing. The versatility of Izuku's quirk made it extremely useful, but he always had to be conscious of just how much he'd used each aspect. That tiny burst of wind he'd used to get to the top of the building might not seem like much, but even those tiny uses could add up quickly if he wasn't careful. It was also a simple fact that the limit he had for each aspect wasn't entirely equal. In the years after the final aspect had manifested, Tsugawa had done his best to provide a training plan that would regularly cycle through each aspect so that Izuku wouldn't lose familiarity with any of them. It was a training plan he'd done his best to stick to after those sessions had come to an end. Even so, each aspect of his quirk was different and the nature of a couple of them made it difficult to practice on his own. Kajiro, the shadow aspect of Izuku's quirk, was probably the one he found himself able to use the most. The applications of his fire and water aspects were similar enough that he could use the two of them for an equal stretch of time, and his earth aspect, which was too dangerous to use in his apartment, was easily the one that he had the lowest endurance for. His light and wind aspects weren't used very often, but they were better suited to short bursts anyway. He'd be fine with those as long as he kept from getting too overconfident. Which brought him back to his current position, crouched down on that roof and watching as the first skirmish came to an end. The fight hadn't taken long at all, but it was still clear that the robots were tough. One or two of the applicants who had been involved in the fight were taking a brief pause to catch their breath, the rest were already rushing off to find more robots. The ground was cracked and pockmarked with tiny craters from the battle, but Izuku paid little mind to it as he scanned the damage done to the machines. They were all dented to varying degrees, resting in crumpled heaps on the concrete. It was difficult to make out any finer details from his vantage point, but he caught the occasional flicker of sparks from what must be torn wires. One of the robots had been severed cleanly in two. Izuku could see the red of its eye flashing lazily from where its head had landed on top of a trash can. It didn't take an unreasonable amount of damage to take them out, so it seemed, but Izuku knew not to celebrate too early. A large sheet of metal had broken off one of the robots, and Izuku could see a large number 1 painted on it. Present Mike had warned them that the difficulty varied based on the numbers, the points. The only question now was just how much more difficult was the next tier? He didn't have time to seek out and observe robots for each tier, but if he could just find one of the 2 pointers, that would be enough for him to put his plan into motion. Hopefully. With that thought in mind, he stood up and strained his ears to listen for the sounds of fighting. It didn't take long. He turned in the opposite direction of the street he'd just been watching and took a deep breath to steady himself. The wind wrapped around his shoulders again and he quickly propelled himself to the next roof. Then the next. Then the next. The 2-pointer went down with a thud. Izuku wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, clutching a broken piece of metal pole in the other. He'd spent as much time exercising as he could in preparation for the exam, but nothing as intense as this, especially considering he'd never really been in an actual fight before. He had a quick glance around before straining his ears, listening out for mechanical whirs and the sounds of combat as he walked. Flying would be faster, but he didn't want to use up too much of his wind aspect just in case he needed to make a quick getaway. He'd taken down enough robots by this point to be fairly confident when fighting one, but he didn't want to risk getting swarmed and having no way out. He rounded a corner, bracing himself to run when he caught a familiar red gleam. He'd only managed to take a single step before the robot was forced to the side, smashing against the side of the building, head crumpling on contact. Izuku blinked and saw the stern-faced boy from earlier looking back at him. The boy spared him a brief nod before speeding off, looking for his next target. Anyone else would have probably been disappointed at someone else taking out their target, but Izuku found it difficult to be anything other than impressed. If he wasn't so sure that the other boy disliked him, he'd probably try to ask him about his quirk once the exam was over. Exam, right. Focus. He'd found an easy rhythm to settle into after the first couple of robots he'd taken out. His flames wouldn't be much use right now. The robot's metal plating was military grade, the kind that his flames didn't really do much against. Of course, a hot enough flame would do some damage, and his flames would be enough if he could keep at it for long enough. But he couldn't. He couldn't hold his breath for long enough for his usual fire to do much, and while he could make his flames hotter, the hotter the flame the quicker he'd hit his limit. His earth aspect wasn't much help either. Sure, he could make a decent-sized crater when he wanted to, but it wasn't exactly something he could do quickly. Besides, that was his least trained aspect and the backlash didn't feel great on his legs, he kind of needed those right now. Light seemed to be pretty effective. It didn't damage them, but a quick flicker of light aimed at the camera seemed to be enough to confuse the robots for a few brief seconds. If this exam was teaching him anything, it was that a few seconds really did make all the difference sometimes. Kajiro was similarly useful. He'd found himself directing the shadow at nearby walls or had it stand in the middle of the street to draw the robots' attention, managing to sneak up behind them and start dealing damage while they were distracted. It helped that Kajiro didn't really give him any noticeable drawbacks, though that was mostly down to how often he'd found himself using it over the years. If he still needed to actively focus on the shadow to get it to do anything, things would be very different right now. His water aspect was pretty useful too, though in order for it to be effective he had to crack the robots open first. The metal pole he was carrying had started to bend from the heavy usage, but he wasn't too concerned. There was enough scrap metal dotting the fake city that he'd be able to find a replacement pretty quickly if it was needed. His wind aspect had a similar issue to his fire. A strong enough gust would, theoretically, be enough to force a robot back, but it would also force him to hit his limit much too quickly. Not that he'd really been planning on using it offensively, especially since it was his best bet at getting out of tricky situations. With all that in mind, his strategy was a fairly simple one. At least, he thought it was. Izuku alternated between using Kajiro and his light to distract or confuse the robots he encountered, driving the metal pole into the weak spots in their armor plating, something which became a little easier each time he did it, before quickly flooding the new hole with water. He was always quick to launch away, using tiny bursts of air to propel himself away from stray sparks and flailing limbs. He wasn't sure how many points he'd earned so far. He'd been too focused on working out a strategy and keeping track of his quirk usage to really give much thought to how his score was doing. Some of the robots he'd engaged had already been fighting other applicants, and sometimes someone else would show up while he was in the middle of his own fights, which added another slight difficulty to keeping track of his score since it wasn't always easy to tell just who landed the final blow. Still, he wasn't too concerned. He'd probably be panicking later, when he didn't have anything to distract his thoughts from his score, but for now he was relatively calm, well, as calm as anyone really could be on a battlefield, because that's what it was, albeit a simulated one. He launched himself onto a nearby roof, kneeling against the concrete as he allowed himself a brief moment to rest. The amount of robots in the area was starting to dwindle, but that didn't mean there weren't more lurking around somewhere ready to be sent into the fake city to replace the ones that had been destroyed. Present Mike had been pretty clear about the exam having a time limit. He'd made no mention of it potentially ending early if they managed to take out all the robots currently inside. Maybe that was just him being paranoid, but he reasoned it was better to at least consider the possibility and be proven wrong than be surprised by it later. He stood up, ready to launch himself back off the roof when he heard a distant rumble. He swiveled on his heel, eyes snapping in the direction the sound had come from, spotting a flash of green in the gap between the buildings. The zero-pointer. He kept a steady pace, alternating between running and gliding as he made his way to the street where he'd spotted the zero-pointer. Others were running too. He caught glimpses of them in the gaps between the buildings, saw them scattered in the fake roads, amongst rubble and scrap metal. They were running, but in the opposite direction. It made sense, he thought to himself as he vaulted over a downed robot. Present Mike had told them during the briefing that there were no points to be won in taking a zero-pointer down. If there were no points to be won, there was no point in engaging, especially not when the robot itself was that massive, and no doubt had the firepower to match. It made sense that the others would want to get as far out of range as possible in favor of more worthwhile targets. Izuku knew that what he was doing now was probably foolish, that he was just wasting what little time he had left. But he was curious, he wanted to see just what kind of machine UA deemed not worth the risk of engaging. He didn't intend to fight it himself, he didn't have the same thirst for battle that Kaken did, he just wanted to see it. He could feel the ground shake beneath his feet as he drew nearer and knew it had absolutely nothing to do with his quirk. His heart pounded in his chest and the air stung his face as he launched himself up to the roof of the nearest building, tracksuit jacket fluttering in the wind. Being up there wasn't really a good idea, he knew. The ground was shaking enough for him to still feel it up here, and a quick glance across the street revealed the deep gouges in some of the other buildings from where the zero-pointer had grabbed and shoved against them. Still, he didn't plan on staying there for long. Just a quick look and then he'd go back to looking for stragglers until time was up. That was it. The zero-pointer sure was intimidating up close. Heavy metal plates and the loud whirring of weapon systems coming online, red eyes gleamed down on the streets below, looking for targets. Logically, Izuku knew it was just like the others, but he'd be lying if he said he didn't feel at least a small flash of fear at the sheer scale of it. He could see why they'd been advised not to engage it. His curiosity satisfied, Izuku turned to leave. Somewhere beneath him in the street, another applicant screamed. Izuku whirled back around, eyes snapping down to the street below. His gaze flitted around quickly, looking for anyone who might be in the zero-pointer's path. There. He spotted movement in a pile of rubble. It had been brief and he was high up enough that he probably wouldn't have seen it at all if he hadn't already been looking. Was someone trapped? He chanced another quick glance at the zero-pointer. It was closer than he'd like, but he should have just enough time if he was careful. Izuku dropped down into the alleyway, hoping to avoid attracting the robot's attention until he was ready to act. He peered at the pile of rubble again. There was more of it than he'd first thought, but whether or not that was a problem depended on how stuck the other applicant was. The other applicant shifted. Izuku froze for a second when he spotted brown hair. It was the girl from earlier, the one who'd stopped him from falling. He took a breath to steady himself as he assessed the situation. For the most part she seemed fine, it looked like most of the rubble had missed her. His gaze flicked to her leg, that was what was stuck. They wouldn't have to move much. Right. He rolled his shoulders before darting out into the street, doing his best to ignore the sounds coming from the zero-pointer. He knew it had seen him. He didn't stop until he reached the girl's side, crouching down so he could be heard over the noise without shouting. "Can you move?" he asked. The girl nodded. "Good, I can help loosen some of this if you think you can pull your leg out?" She nodded again and Izuku took another quick breath. He focused on his legs, planting his feet as firmly as he could and tensing his muscles. The ground beneath them began to tremble, painfully slow at first, but then quick enough to actually do something. The concrete began to crack and Izuku waved his hand. The girl didn't need any further prompting before crawling out of the rubble. They hurried over to the alleyway Izuku had just been hiding in, leaning against each other to offer support as they ventured deeper, not stopping until they reached the other side. The girl's ankle had been hurt by the rubble, and Izuku's legs ached from a combination of all the running he'd been doing and the use of his least trained aspect. "Thanks," the girl said, lowering herself down to sit on the remains of a downed two-pointer. "It was nothing." Izuku responded, following her example. "You'd do the same if this morning taught me anything." He added a moment later, flashing her a small smile. The girl frowned for a few seconds before the realization dawned, and Izuku's smile stretched a little wider when he heard her laugh. The robot beneath them began to rise and Izuku felt a brief flash of panic, worrying that it hadn't been destroyed at all despite missing its head and one arm. But just as soon as it had lifted, it dropped again, landing with a thud that Izuku felt reverberate through his bones. The girl glanced at him apologetically even as her laughter continued. Izuku couldn't help but join in. "Well, it's good to know I made an impression," she said once the laughter had stopped. He was about to ask for her name when the announcement rang out that the exam had concluded. There was something almost eerie about those first few minutes after their time ran out, a sudden silence that was a little jarring without the sounds of battle to fill it, a mock city that seemed hauntingly empty now that they had the time to take it all in without any distractions. It was probably just the leftover adrenaline, Izuku thought to himself as he trudged along, only dimly aware of the girl half limping by his side. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice coming out a little shakier than he'd like. The girl glanced up at him, her face blank while she processed the question. "I'll be fine," she responded, her lips quirking with a tired smile when she realized he wasn't convinced. "Really, I mean. It hurts a bit but it's not too bad." "If you're sure," Izuku trailed off, turning back around when the girl nodded. Still, he made sure to keep close to her side as they navigated the fake streets, skirting around the occasional crater and pile of scrap metal. He wasn't sure how much help he would be if the girl's ankle got too bad. The ache in his own legs was worse now that the adrenaline had worn off, making his footsteps shakier than he'd like, and he'd used too much of his wind aspect to be comfortable carrying someone else in the air, but keeping close made him feel useful. A few smaller robots wheeled past them, and it was only the sight of the stretchers carried between them that prevented the two of them from flinching. Sure, the exam was technically finished, but some jumpiness was to be expected. One pair of robots stopped next to them, tilting their heads with a silent question. Izuku glanced at the girl, she shook her head, the robots kept moving. "Someone else probably needs the help more," she said once they were gone, as though to defend herself. "I wasn't judging you," Izuku said with a tired chuckle. "Believe me, I'm the last person who should be." Besides, he didn't say anything either. They weren't the last ones out, but there was already a sizable crowd gathered near a lone figure just a few short paces from the gates. Recovery girl, Izuku realized. If he wasn't already dead on his feet, he'd probably be rambling right now, blurting out a steady stream of facts and questions until his voice gave up on him, or until someone cut him off, whichever happened first. But he was exhausted, and all he could do was stumble forward, barely managing not to jostle the girl who had ended up leaning against his shoulder again just as they'd reached the entrance. Recovery girl glanced up at them from the applicant she'd just healed, waiting until the boy had heaved himself off the stretcher before making her way over to them, a few other applicants clumsily stepping aside to clear a path for her. She tooted once she was close enough to see what was wrong, though Izuku wasn't sure whether it was aimed at their injuries or at the fact they denied a stretcher. She tended to the girl first, pressing a kiss against the back of her hand. It only took a few seconds for the effects of her quirk to kick in, and it wasn't long before the girl was standing more steadily on her own 2 feet. The hero handed her a few gummies before moving her attention over to Izuku. Her quirk didn't do much for the ache in his legs, but it was enough to heal the few scrapes he'd accumulated but hadn't noticed. "Thanks," he mumbled when she pressed a few gummies into his hand, his exhaustion weighing on him a little heavier now. He didn't know if Recovery Girl had said anything else, but he'd caught the rather pointed glance she'd directed at the bus that had brought them here and needed no further instruction. The girl followed him as he headed over and stepped inside, the two of them collapsing as one into a pair of seats towards the back. There were 3 other applicants also waiting inside, but none of them seemed particularly interested in starting a conversation, so they paid them no mind. "I didn't catch your name," Izuku murmured quietly, being careful not to disturb the peace as he popped one of the gummies in his mouth, humming appreciatively at the flavor. "Lime. Ochako Uraraka." The girl responded, just as quiet. "What's yours?" "Izuku Midoriya." The two of them shared a small smile before turning their attention back to their sweets. Izuku had just popped the last one in his mouth when he felt something nudge against his hand. Uraraka's phone. It took him a few seconds to figure out what she was asking, but eventually his brain woke up enough to carefully grab the device and enter his number. He handed it back to her and fumbled around for his own phone so she could do the same. They fell silent after that, content to enjoy some peace and quiet while they waited for the rest of the applicants to be checked over and herded onto the bus. Izuku wasn't sure which of them would make it into the hero course, or how many would make it into UA at all. Hero schools held their entrance exams at different times after all, and most would-be heroes tended to apply to multiple, but he tried not to think about it too much. He only hoped that he'd done well enough. It wasn't long before the rest of the applicants began to file in, slowly filling the rest of the seats. There were a few fragmented conversations, words spoken in a quiet murmur or a barely audible whisper. They were all too tired for much more than that. There was a soft lurch as the bus began to move and Izuku slumped slightly in his seat, settling into a light doze as the sounds of the others washed over him. It wasn't until the gates to UA appeared around the corner that he let himself wonder how well Kaken had done. He was still tired when they returned to the main UA building, they all were, but the brief rest he'd managed on the bus meant that he wasn't dragging his feet as much as he had been in those first few minutes after the adrenaline had left his system. Kaken had been waiting for him, leaning against the wall and scowling at anyone who looked at him for longer than necessary. He was doing his best to hide it, but Izuku could tell he was tired as well. It was clear in the slight slump of the shoulder that wasn't pressed against the wall. Still, he looked more awake than Izuku felt. "Took you long enough." The other boy huffed once he was close enough. Izuku merely shrugged, offering him a tired grin. It wasn't as though he'd been the one driving the bus. Kaken snorted but said nothing else, pushing off the wall and stalking off. Izuku fell into step behind him. The journey back home was quiet. Despite what most people tended to assume, Kaken was pretty quiet when the rest of his friends, though he stubbornly refused to call them that, weren't around, well, so long as there was no one else currently annoying him. Izuku hadn't really been up for talking either, instead choosing to keep himself occupied by scrolling through various hero forums and glancing over the group chat he shared with his handful of friends. A few of them had sent him good luck messages. He smiled as he typed out a quick reply and shoved his phone back in his pocket. There would be time for a proper conversation later. Kaken watched him out of the corner of his eye, snorting and looking away when Izuku's gaze slid over to him. They went their separate ways once they reached the station, Izuku muttering a quick farewell which quickly morphed into a quiet chuckle when Kaken merely flipped him off. It wasn't until he was slotting his key in the lock to his apartment that he remembered what his mom had said before he left that morning. "There'll be a treat waiting for you when you get back." He hadn't had much time to think about it when he'd left, and he'd forgotten all about it until now. He idly wondered what it could be, but nothing really stuck out to him. Dimly, he recognized that he'd been standing there with his key in the door for a few minutes and quickly shook the thought off. Whatever was waiting for him on the other side, he wouldn't find out if he stayed standing outside. "I'm home," he called out once he stepped inside, listening out for his mom. She didn't say anything back, but he could hear sounds coming from the kitchen, so he knew she was there. Shrugging to himself, Izuku turned to shut the door before moving to kick his shoes off, not suspecting anything as he straightened back up. He heard a warm chuckle behind him and promptly froze. It was a laugh he recognized, but he hadn't expected to hear it for a few more days. He whirled around and sked in a sharp breath when he saw his dad standing in the hallway. "Hey kiddo." The man smiled at him, the motion pulling at the freckles on his cheeks. "It's been a while." Izuku said nothing as he launched himself forward, his tiredness forgotten as a grin stretched across his face, wide enough that it was almost painful. He heard his dad huff as he slammed against him, the man stumbling back a couple of steps before regaining his footing. "I take it that means you're happy to see me?" Izuku merely nodded against his chest, his grin stretching impossibly wider in place of the words that wouldn't come. His dad breathed out another soft chuckle, his own arms lifting up to press against Izuku's back. He could smell the scent of the cologne that he vaguely remembered from the last time his dad had come over for a visit, the one he always used to cover up the subtle scent of smoke that came from his quirk. He didn't know how long they stood there like that, neither did he care. They separated eventually and Izuku let his gaze flit around his dad's face. The video calls happened often enough that there wasn't really anything surprising about it, same dark hair, same gray strands that had started to creep in near his temples, but there were some details that didn't show up that well on camera, like the small creases around his eyes and mouth from smiling. "I see you found your surprise," his mom said quietly, the smile clear in her voice. Izuku peered around his dad's shoulder to see her head poking around the corner, a happy glint in her eyes. "How?" He trailed off, pausing to clear his throat when his voice came out a little rough. "Your mom reminded me you'd be taking the entrance exam soon," his dad said. "I figured I should probably come back for a visit before my son becomes a big-name hero and forgets all about me." He was smiling as he said it, his voice taking on that airy tone it always did when he was joking. "I would never." Izuku shot back, shaking his head even as a small burst of laughter slipped through his lips. "I know," his dad responded, his eyes soft as he looked at him. "I can't stay for long this time, but I'm all yours for a few days if you'll have me." And really, would Izuku ever refuse? He said nothing as he stepped forward, tucking himself close to his dad's side and leading them both to his mom. Her eyes flit between the two of them, her smile still fixed on her face as she reached out to pull Izuku into a hug. He relaxed into it, laughing quietly when he felt his dad hugging him from behind, his arms reaching around until his hands were pressing against his mom's shoulders. Best surprise ever. Those few days he'd had with his dad passed all too quickly. They always did. It wasn't very often that he got to see his dad in person, nowhere near as often as any of them would like, so they always tried to make the most of it before he had to leave. Sometimes that meant poring over the notes Izuku had taken of various quirks, both his own and those he'd glimpsed on the news or out in the street. Sometimes it meant venturing out to new restaurants and attractions that had popped up in the time between his visits or older ones that held happy memories for all three of them. Still, their time together always came to an end at some point, and it wasn't long before Izuku was waving his dad goodbye at the airport. The man had promised to try to come back again soon, for longer next time, though he hadn't said when. The ride back home was a little tearful, it always was. But neither Izuku nor his mom complained. The long distance wasn't always easy, but they at least had the video calls to tide them over. His thoughts didn't turn to the entrance exam until later that night, while he was struggling to fall asleep. His dad's visit had successfully distracted him for a few days, but now that the man was gone, it was all he could think about. Logically, he knew he couldn't have done too badly. As far as the written test went, he'd been studying and analyzing quirks, and heroics in general, for as long as he could remember, and he had enough control over the various aspects of his quirk that he was fairly confident he hadn't fumbled the practical exam. But had it been enough? UA was the most well-known hero school in Japan. It was the one most would-be heroes set their sights on when thinking of schools to apply to. They got the most applications, and anyone who was serious enough about becoming a hero had surely put in the same effort, and that was before taking into consideration the number of applicants who were possibly related to fully licensed heroes. Izuku might be confident that he hadn't completely failed, but that didn't necessarily mean he'd passed either. His mind whirred, replaying fragmented memories of the practical exam as he tried to work out if he could have done anything differently, if there was anything he'd missed. It probably wouldn't do him much good now, but he couldn't help it. He was tempted to grab his notebook and start writing things down, but he was supposed to be trying to sleep. He must have drifted off at some point, managing to sleep through his alarm, but he knew it hadn't been for long. Trying to focus during those last few weeks of middle school proved to be a whole new challenge. The concern over how well he'd done prodded at the corners of his mind, creeping in at random while he made notes and studied for their final exams. The more time that passed without hearing anything, the worse his worries grew. His friends tried to reassure him in their own way, distracting him with interesting news stories, random videos, and in video games when their words weren't enough. It didn't really work, but he appreciated their efforts all the same. Kaken had merely scoffed when he'd mentioned his worries to him. He'd grinned sharply and insisted that the UA administration would be foolish not to accept them. He'd sounded so confident when he'd said it, but there was a hint of something uncertain in his eyes. Izuku didn't bring it up again. His mom agreed to arrange a few more sessions with Tsugawa while they waited to hear from UA. He had enough control over his quirk by now that regular sessions were no longer necessary. They hadn't been for a while, but the familiar exercises and routines gave him something else to focus on. Though he did make sure to request extra time with his Earth aspect, remembering just how much slower it had been in comparison to the others during the exam. Tsugawa had agreed, though the sessions weren't as often as they used to be. It made sense, Izuku acknowledged as he worked the soreness from his legs after a long day of practice. The man had other people who needed his attention, kids whose quirks had only recently come in. He had to prioritize them. Still, he was thankful for whatever assistance the man was able to provide. Ironically enough, it wasn't until Izuku had stopped thinking about the entrance exam that the letter finally arrived. His mom had knocked on his door, looking a little frazzled as she stood there clutching a single envelope. He'd known what it was before she even said anything. She'd handed it to him and headed back to the living room to give him some privacy. Izuku didn't open it immediately. He wanted to, his thumb brushed gently along the seal, but his mind was worrying too much. The answer he'd been waiting for was right there, clutched carefully in the palm of his hand, and yet he was frozen in his seat. What if he hadn't got in? What if you have? A voice that sounded suspiciously like his dad's piped up in the back of his mind. He took a deep breath, clenching his eyes shut as he tore the envelope open. A small disc clattered onto his desk, lighting up with a holographic screen. Izuku's eyes widened when he saw just who was delivering the message. All Might. All Might was teaching at UA? Izuku only half paid attention to the words being spoken, his mind slowly rebooting itself in the face of this sudden revelation. He exhaled a sharp sigh of relief when it was announced that he'd passed, promptly choking on his own breath when the screen changed to show the scores. 60 villain points, and 35 rescue points, leaving him with a total of 95, which put him in first, just ahead of Kaken who'd scored 92. First, he'd come first. The cheer he let out was loud enough for his mom to come running back to his room. She took one look at his face, and the frozen image of the scoreboard, and promptly flashed him a proud smile. the happy tears leaking from her eyes matching his own. He'd done it. Standing before the gates of UA for a second time carried a much different feeling than the first. It was still surreal, almost too good to be true. Like a dream, in a way. The kind of thing a person's mind might come up with at the end of a difficult day to make them feel better, an image of a perfect world. He had a small urge to pinch himself, just to be sure that it wasn't a figment of his imagination, but he resisted. That part hadn't changed, and likely wouldn't for a while. But this time there was nothing intimidating about the towering structure, there was no worry making his stomach churn or his heart pound in his chest. Was that all the difference a set of numbers and a new uniform made? It couldn't be, but that was all that had really changed between the entrance exam and now. He was still a little nervous, of course. A new school. New classmates. Who wouldn't be nervous? But it was the kind of nervousness that lingered in the corner of his mind, just enough for its presence to be known, but not enough to taint his mind with apprehension and fear. Izuku took a small breath, hand tightening momentarily around one of the straps of his bag, and walked forward. Right now, that was all he had to do. Finding his classroom was relatively easy, barring one wrong turn, and it wasn't long before Izuku was pushing open the, surprisingly large, door for Class 1A. His eyes immediately locked on Kaken, who was already locked in an argument with one of their new classmates. Izuku vaguely remembered seeing him during the exam. He wasn't surprised to see him. He'd already known from his own acceptance letter that Kaken had made it into the hero course, he'd always known he would, and they'd compared class assignments the day after. It was nice to have a familiar face around, a sentiment that he knew the blonde shared even if he'd never actually admit it. He was about to step in and attempt to break the argument up when he heard someone say his name. "Hey, Midoriya?" He turned, eyes locking on the girl from the exam, Uraraka. They'd messaged each other a couple of times since then but barely anything more than a few words and nothing about UA. "You made it." She beamed, an expression that Izuku could feel himself mirroring. He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself being cut off again. "Go somewhere else if you want to play at being friends." His gaze slid down to the floor, to the man staring back at him from inside a sleeping bag. Well, this should be interesting. A quirk assessment test. It made sense, Izuku mused to himself as their teacher explained it to them on the field. They'd been asked to provide information about their quirks once their places had been secured, but it was likely that some things had been missed and it was also possible that some information was out of date, especially if, like Izuku, they'd been doing some more quirk training between the entrance exam and now. Establishing a baseline on the first day was only logical. Still, it looks fun, huh? Aizawa-sensei's voice turned cold, silencing them and making the girl who'd first made the comment flinch. "You have 3 years to become a hero. Will you have an attitude like that the whole time?" His gaze swept over them all one by one, unimpressed. Subconsciously, Izuku held his breath. He wasn't the only one. "All right." Aizawa-sensei spoke again once he'd seen, or hadn't seen, whatever it was he'd been looking for. "Whoever comes in last place in all 8 tests will be judged to have no potential and will be punished with expulsion." The words shocked the air out of his lungs, a small wisp of smoke slipping through his lips along with it. Expulsion? Just like that? He'd known UA would be tough. No one, barring those who were, perhaps, a touch too overconfident for their own good, signed up for a hero course expecting it to be easy, especially not one as renowned as UA. But to be threatened with expulsion on the first day? Izuku glanced around at the others, his shock was mirrored on their faces to varying degrees. Some, like the girl with pink skin, the one who made the comment about the assessment being fun, seemed terrified, others tried to appear calm but hadn't managed to hide their more subtle tells, a clenched jaw, fingers drumming against crossed arms, feet shuffling in the grass. He could feel his limbs beginning to tremble at the announcement, he forced his muscles to stiffen up in an attempt to stop it. The same was true for Kaken and Uraraka when he glanced at them. The former's expression was no different to the one Izuku was used to, eyes narrowed and lips twisted into a scowl, though his jaw had tightened with their teacher's words. Uraraka, on the other hand, was pretty similar to Izuku with the way she tensed up, fingers curling into fists at her sides. The only ones who truly seemed unconcerned were the two stood just at the edge of the group, the girl with black hair pulled into a high ponytail and the boy with two-toned hair and a burned scar over his left eye. Were they really that confident? Aizawa-sensei watched them impassively for several long moments before apparently deciding he'd given them enough time to think. "We're free to do what we want about the circumstances of our students," he said, effectively cutting off whatever argument any of them could come up with. Not that any of them were really in a hurry to try. His eyes almost seemed to flash red as he spoke. It was brief enough that Izuku almost brushed it off as a trick of the light and yet something stopped him. It was weirdly familiar, something he'd seen before but now struggled to place. A part of him was tempted to mention it, but now wasn't the time. Welcome to UA's hero course. Once he deemed their shock at the announcement had faded enough for them to be able to focus, Aizawa-sensei led them further onto the field, where a simple racetrack had been painted with neat white lines. It was a perfectly normal thing to see on a school campus, but seeing something like it on UA grounds still managed to be a little surreal. It was a dumb thing to be surprised by, but Izuku decided to blame it on the still slightly frazzled state of his nerves. UA wasn't just a hero school after all, even if its more traditional curriculum tended to be overshadowed by it. The heroics track was for exactly that, teaching heroes, and as such the usual things that people immediately thought of when gym class came to mind were replaced with more specialized training. The students who were here for the other courses UA offered had the more mundane options that all schools shared, regardless of whether they had a hero course or not. Izuku had done his research back when he first decided that he wanted to go to UA, looking into all the courses they offered. Of course, he'd focused more on heroics at first, but he'd made sure to look into the others later on. A lot of kids his age wanted to be heroes. He needed to have some kind of backup plan just in case he didn't make the cut, and, while it wasn't something that he could claim to have much personal interest in, UA did have a few school sports teams. The sight of the racetrack was normal, it was necessary. Once his nerves had finished settling, Izuku forced himself to focus. He could think about the structure of the different courses here some other time. The first test was a simple 50-meter dash, the kind of thing that they were already used to doing when it came to gym class. Izuku supposed that was the whole point, getting them to do familiar exercises while also allowing them some partial freedom with their quirks, a safe and simple introduction to their training. Izuku stood at the starting line once his name was called, willing himself not to pay too much attention to the others standing next to him. This was a competition, yes, one with a pretty harsh penalty, but it was also to establish baselines for them going forward. He only had to focus on his own performance. When they were given the signal to start, Izuku exhaled slowly, letting the air gather around his shoulders and push him forward. Instead of focusing it at the ground like he would normally, he willed the air to propel him forward. He still lifted off the ground slightly, but the tips of his shoes just barely scraped along the dirt. Using his wind aspect like this was a little tricky, too little and it wouldn't benefit him at all, too much and he'd be flying. Of course, he figured that wouldn't be a problem as long as he managed to stay in his lane, but it was easy to start drifting once he was airborne, so he didn't want to risk it right now. His time wasn't anything too impressive, at least not if he was to compare it to some of his new classmates, but he'd definitely been faster than he would have been if he hadn't used his quirk at all. The second test, grip strength, was the first test where his quirk couldn't help him. He could breathe fire, create tremors in the earth, shine light from his eyes, manipulate his shadow, stream water from his hands, and fly. But he didn't have super strength. It wasn't a complaint, though it would probably sound like one to anyone who didn't know him. Izuku knew he'd been pretty lucky in the quirk department. There were already so many things he could do, so many more situations he had an advantage in that others didn't. Still, he couldn't do everything, and neither could anyone else. He squeezed the device, managing a reasonably average score, and smiled as he passed it over to the next person. Next was the standing long jump. Another test for his wind aspect. He launched himself forward, propelling himself onwards with his quirk until he'd cleared the sandbox before gliding back down to the floor. He could have kept going, but there wouldn't have been any point to it. The repeated sidestep was another test that his quirk couldn't help him with. He still managed an average enough score that he wasn't worried about it and watched, wide-eyed, as one of his classmates pinballed between two piles of purple ball that hadn't been there when the test had started. The ball throw was probably the test that stuck out to him the most, partially because one of his classmates managed to score infinity, not too surprising, given the nature of Uraraka's quirk, but impressive all the same, but also because he'd managed to use a different one of his aspects this time. Sure, he could throw things with his wind aspect if he really wanted to, but that didn't mean he liked doing it. The wind tended to settle around his shoulders, which was useful for deflecting anything, be it an actual attack or a falling object, that might strike him from behind, but it made it very difficult to aim. And if he wanted to use it to help him throw something forward, he'd have to curl it around his shoulder first, which significantly reduced the amount of force behind it. Luckily, he had some other tricks up his sleeve. He held the ball firmly in his hand, keeping his arm straight as he raised it to aim at the sky. He took a few moments to brace his wrist, remembering what happened the first time he'd tried this during his quirk assessments with Tsugawa. Izuku took a quick breath and fired, launching a stream of water from his hand and sending the ball flying. He kept it up until he saw the ball land a fair distance away on the field. It wasn't quite as far as the throw Kaken had managed in that initial demonstration just before they'd been told what would happen if they failed, but it was still impressive enough. The long-distance run saw him using his wind aspect again. But the final 2 tests, the seated toe touch and sit-ups, hadn't required his quirk at all. It was mildly disappointing that he hadn't been able to use more than 2 aspects, but he didn't let himself think about it for too long. They had 3 years after all, there would be plenty of other chances for the other parts of his quirk to be put to use. It didn't take long for Aizawa-sensei to put together their final scores, and Izuku was sure he wasn't the only one frantically scanning the board for his place. He was roughly in the middle of the group, a realization which had his shoulders slumping in relief. The boy from the repeated sidestep test, Mineta, according to the board, wasn't as lucky. They could all hear him sob while Aizawa-sensei handed him a note and instructed him to find one of the general education teachers. Of course, they'd already been told what would happen to whoever came in last. But Izuku suspected they'd all privately thought, or, more specifically, hoped, that their teacher wouldn't actually go through with it. Though none looked quite as surprised as the girl he'd noticed earlier, one of the 2 students who hadn't been shocked when the penalty was first mentioned. They didn't have much more time to think about it before they were all being herded back to the main building. Izuku was sure he wasn't the only one wondering just what the rest of the year had in store for them. The rest of the day, following the tense atmosphere of the quirk assessment tests, had been surprisingly normal by comparison. It had still been bizarre just rounding a corner in the hallway to see pro-heroes casually walking about, and would likely continue to be for a while, and Izuku had been practically vibrating as he wrestled with the urge to ramble off facts and theories and ask for autographs. He hadn't quite managed to stave it off every time, but the heroes, who also happened to be their teachers, and Izuku totally wasn't freaking out about that, of course not, barely blinked at his sudden bouts of word vomit, signing his notebook and offering idle comments on his theories with friendly smiles and good-natured laughter. Of course, he'd known that UA was mostly staffed by pro-heroes, as was the case with most hero schools in their country, but knowing something wasn't always enough to prepare you for the reality. In this case, the feeling was almost welcome. Privately, Izuku just hoped he wasn't coming across as too much of a fanboy. He totally was. Still, their teachers may be heroes, but most of their subjects were still the standard ones you'd expect at a normal school. It was a little strange seeing them standing there in their hero costumes as they taught them maths and English and all the other mundane subjects, but it helped to make them feel more like teachers instead of just being heroes, made them feel more approachable. Not that they weren't already, but there was still a difference between talking to them as teachers and talking to them as heroes. The end of the day was upon them all too soon. Uraraka and the stern-faced boy from the entrance exam were standing outside the front of the school when Izuku walked out. Uraraka beamed when she caught sight of him, waving him over enthusiastically while the boy eyed him with some level of curiosity. Kaken scoffed beside him and stalked off ahead, muttering something about not waiting around for him as he went. Izuku walked over to join them, paying Kaken's grumbling no mind as he returned Uraraka's smile. "I'm so glad you made it," she said once he was close enough, apparently wanting to continue their conversation from homeroom, the one that had been interrupted by their teacher's arrival. Her enthusiasm had dimmed a little since then, but that was to be expected after the day they'd had. "That makes 2 of us." Izuku laughed, breathless from a weird combination of exhaustion and awe. It still didn't feel entirely real, and a part of him was still expecting to wake up in his bed to discover it had all been a dream. He knew it would fade eventually, but for now it was all he could feel. "I'm glad you made it too." The other boy standing with them cleared his throat quietly, a little stiff and awkward as he glanced between them. "Oh, right," Uraraka blurted, glancing at him apologetically before continuing. "This is Ida, he was in our group during the entrance exam." Izuku didn't remember seeing him during the exam itself, but he remembered him from the auditorium and he thought he might have glimpsed him outside of the gates to the mock city. "It's nice to meet you, Ida," Izuku said, flashing the taller boy a smile. "You were pretty impressive earlier," he added, remembering his speed during Aizawa-sensei's tests. Ida blinked at him for a few seconds, the comment catching him off guard. "Thank you," he said, idly reaching up to fiddle with his glasses. "You were rather impressive yourself. I was under the impression that your quirk only involved air." Izuku could understand the confusion. He'd mostly just used his wind aspect during the tests, when he could use his quirk at all, and, while he didn't remember seeing Ida during the entrance exam, he guessed the other boy might have seen him flying around the fake city. Seeing him shoot water out of his hands must have been surprising. "My quirk has a lot of parts." Izuku shrugged. He was tempted to explain it, but there was a lot to go over, and he didn't want them to think he was bragging. "You were really cool too, Uraraka," he said after a brief pause. Partially to change the subject and partially because he didn't want her to think she was being left out. Oh, that was nothing. She laughed, waving her hands. If I can get something to go high enough, it just gets stuck in the atmosphere, that does the rest of the work for me. Doesn't it still take a lot out of you? Izuku asked, remembering how she'd been when he found her during the entrance exam. It depends. Uraraka shrugged. 1 or 2 items won't cause me much trouble so long as they're not too big or too heavy, it's when I try doing it with too many items at once that it starts affecting me. Can you make objects fall faster too? He asked, then shook his head. Sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions. It's okay. She laughed, flashing him a reassuring smile. To answer your question, I can't. I can remove the effects of gravity from something, but I can't increase it. Impressive all the same. Ida said. They didn't talk for much longer, all 3 of them still a little tired from the unexpected workout that morning as well as from the universal exhaustion that everyone seemed to get after the first day in a new environment. They walked to the station together, the companionable silence occasionally interrupted by brief murmurs or tentative laughter. There was some awkward fumbling when they finally arrived, passing their phones back and forth as Izuku and Uraraka added Ida's number to their contacts and he noted down both of theirs. They lived in different parts of the city, so they wouldn't be catching the same train, unfortunately, so they simply stood there, letting the conversations of the other people in the station wash over them while they waited. Their second day started out relatively normal. They arrived one by one, settling into homeroom and falling silent when they glimpsed the yellow sleeping bag their teacher never seemed to stray far from. There was still something about him that felt familiar to Izuku, a name balancing on the tip of his tongue that he hadn't yet breathed into existence. The man's eyes met his briefly, Izuku looked away. Their morning classes passed by without incident and their lunch break was about as peaceful as it could be in a school filled with aspiring heroes. Izuku sat with Uraraka and Ida amongst some of their other classmates, idly contributing to fragmented conversation topics as their excitement grew, the air becoming charged with anticipation as the minutes dragged on. It was a feeling they all shared, though some were better at hiding it. Because after lunch came their first heroics class. They'd passed the entrance exam, made it through their first day, mostly, unscathed, they were hero course students already. But, with their first official training session only minutes away, everything suddenly felt more real. All Might burst through the door. All Might. He'd known the #1 hero would begin teaching here this year, had found out when he received his entrance exam results. But there had been a fair amount of excitement since then, and with all the other changes that came with starting at a new school it had slipped his mind. Izuku was practically vibrating in his seat as he watched his favorite hero walk up to the front of the room, a quick glance around the room confirming he wasn't the only one. All Might beamed at them from behind the podium, his voice carrying a small hint of excitement as he informed them that he'd be their heroics teacher. There were a few hushed murmurs following the announcement, and All Might allowed them a few minutes to get it out of their systems before regaining their attention. At one point he pulled out a remote, and with the touch of a button 19 cases slid out of a section of the wall that they hadn't noticed yet. They all knew what they were looking at before he could say anything, their hero costumes. First up, Teams A and D. Their partners and opponents had been chosen at random. Perhaps it wasn't the most effective system, but the simple truth was that they'd only known each other for a couple of days so far. They didn't really know each other's quirks yet, because there was only so much they could glean from a few fitness tests, or if their personalities would mesh well enough for them to work together. Choosing at random helped save some time, and prevented unnecessary arguments. Besides, they wouldn't always get to choose their partners in the field and Izuku had seen enough clips online of, mostly new, heroes butting heads because they weren't used to each other's methods. The sooner they got used to adapting to working with different people, the better. Izuku turned to Flash Kakin a quick grin. The other boy rolled his eyes with a barely audible scoff, but was quick to respond with a smirk, his eyes flashing dangerously. Izuku chuckled under his breath, moving to follow Uraraka once they were instructed to get into their positions. So, what's the deal with you and Bakugo? Uraraka asked while they looked over the building plans they'd been provided, fidgeting slightly with her costume's visor. She'd told him just before the teams had been chosen that it wasn't quite what she'd had in mind, that she might put in a request for a few changes once she got the chance. We're friends. Izuku shrugged, flexing his fingers in his gloves. His own costume was relatively simple, the sheer variety of the things his quirk let him do made coming up with a good design difficult, so he decided to focus purely on the functionality for now. Gloves with open palms for his water, leg braces for when he used his earth aspect, among a few other things. Maybe he'd have a few more ideas after this lesson. Rivals then. Uraraka mused as she pointed at something on the printout. Are you planning on being a hero duo? It depends on the day. Izuku responded, sighing with mock exasperation as he double-checked the layout of some of the interior walls. Lips quirking with a small smile when Uraraka laughed. We've got a few years before we have to decide. They should probably be talking about the exercise, but they already had a rough idea of a strategy with enough room to improvise when something went wrong. Besides, talking about other stuff kept him, from overthinking. How do you think Ida's doing? Izuku huffed out a quiet laugh, rolling his shoulder in anticipation. He hadn't known the other boy for long, having only really spoken to him the day before, but it didn't take much effort to figure out he valued respect and cooperation. Two things which Kaken rarely cared about, especially, not when he got competitive. Ida definitely had his work cut out for him with this pair up. I'm sure he'll be fine. He responded, not quite able to hide his smile. Wasn't that something else they'd have to learn? How to work with people they didn't get on with. Besides, it wasn't like Kaken was completely unreasonable, well, not all the time, at least. And if not, that just makes things easier for us, right? Uraraka grinned, her eyes shining with badly concealed amusement. Right. That was certainly one way of looking at it. Whatever else they could have said was cut off by the sound of All Might's voice booming through their earpieces. It was officially time for their round to start. Ready? Izuku asked, wind curling around his shoulders but not lifting him just yet. Let's do it. Uraraka grinned, grabbing onto his arm with one hand. Together, the two of them lifted up and launched themselves through one of the windows. Time to focus. They were on guard as soon as they slipped through the window, eyes scanning the hallways and ears straining for the sound of footsteps or a quirk activation. So far, nothing. There hadn't been any traps waiting for them. Izuku hadn't thought there would be. The building they were standing in was too big for there to be a trap at every window, not with the amount of time they'd had to prepare. Of course, with Ida's quirk they might have managed it, but neither of their opponents were the type to set traps. Sure, they both understood the merits of it, but Kaken preferred to deal with his opponents personally. He wouldn't set up a trap unless he really thought it would be necessary, and Ida wasn't the type to resort to tactics he considered to be underhanded. He'd said as much while they'd been walking to the changing rooms earlier. Was that foolish? Maybe. But right now it was making things a little easier for them so Izuku wouldn't complain. Are you sure about this? Uraraka asked, already turning to head down one of the hallways. She wasn't doubting the plan, he knew, just making sure. Yeah. He nodded. Good luck. You too. They darted in different directions, Uraraka keeping to the outer corridors while Izuku ran further inside. It would have probably been quicker to simply peer through the windows on each floor until they found the prop bomb. The two of them certainly could have managed it. But fighting both Ida and Kaken in such a small room likely wouldn't end well for them. They had to force them to split up. Which wouldn't be too difficult, Izuku mused to himself as he rounded another corner. The longer it took for them to find the bomb, the more suspicious the other pair would become. They'd start looking for them soon enough. Of course, the smart move would probably be to send Ida out to look for them. Navigating the tight corridors with his quirk likely wouldn't be easy, but there wasn't much either Izuku or Uraraka would be able to do to avoid him if he managed to get a straight shot at one of them. But that would mean having Kaken stay behind to defend the bomb. And Kaken hated playing defense. Besides, Izuku knew that the other boy had been looking forward to finally being able to go up against each other with their quirks, an excitement which he, admittedly, shared. This was the first chance they had. There was no way Izuku could see Kaken missing it. So, really, it was for the best that they got it out of their systems now. And, sure enough, his prediction was right. He heard the footsteps first, thundering eagerly down the hallway he was approaching. Izuku halted, planting his feet firmly. He could feel his body tensing in anticipation. A familiar head of blonde hair rounded the corner, followed quickly by a smoking palm. Izuku had just enough time to raise his arm before that hand shot forward, wind coiling around his shoulders and wrapping around his arm only seconds before an explosion was unleashed. The wind deflected most of it, but the heat was still enough to singe the sleeve of his costume and the sudden flash stung his eyes. He staggered back, blinking rapidly to clear the black spots from his vision. Is that the best you got? He laughed, his voice carrying more confidence than he actually felt. His quirk gave him more options than Kaken's did, but the blonde had more combat experience. Sure, it was mostly just the occasional scuffle with older kids who, mistakenly, thought they could beat him, but it was still more experience than Izuku had. Kaken's mouth stretched into a challenging, bordering on feral, grin, his eyes glinting dangerously. We're just getting started. Kaken growled. Now less talking and more fighting, nerd. The blonde shot forward again, tiny pops sounding as he readied his quirk for another blast. Izuku didn't give him the chance. Wordlessly, he raised one arm and shot a jet of water directly into Kaken's face. The other boy recoiled, coughing and spluttering as he spat out some of the water that managed to get in his mouth. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and he hissed as he shook his head to prevent any from dripping into his eyes. The glare Kaken shot back at him was pure venom, and Izuku felt his lip curl up in amusement. He looked like a drowned cat. "You'll regret that." Kaken's voice came out as a low, dangerous growl. Izuku couldn't resist one more quick tease. "I thought you said no more talking." Kaken shot forward again. Izuku swerved. He wasn't able to dodge the attack entirely, but he managed to at least avoid the main brunt of it. He grimaced when he felt the heat against his shoulder, his skin smarting beneath the singed fabric of his costume. He spared a brief second to mentally apologize to the support department, hoping the damage wouldn't be too troublesome for them to repair by the time this lesson was over. The communicator crackled in his ear. "Midoriya? Are you there?" Uraraka's voice was quiet enough that he could barely hear her, as though she was trying to avoid attention. She was probably close to Ida then, he realized, which meant she'd found the bomb. He leaped back from another explosion, using the wind to propel himself further. Kaken grumbled under his breath, obviously displeased by his retreat. Izuku paid it no mind. As fun as fighting like this was, they had an objective. One that they were close to completing. It took barely any effort to separate his shadow from him. This part of his quirk was always the easiest of the 6. He watched as it drifted up from the floor, morphing into something more solid beside him. "Keep him busy, Kajiro," he instructed, turning on his heel and sprinting down one of the hallways. The room he was just in darkened behind him. He didn't really need to verbalize his instructions to Kajiro, he didn't really need to instruct it at all. But speaking the words out loud gave him some form of comfort, even if the thing he was talking to wasn't really sentient. He lifted a hand to his ear. "Uraraka?" He spoke quietly with a slight grimace, aware that he'd left her hanging. "Did you find it?" "Yeah," she responded, giggling at something Izuku couldn't see. Ida's really getting into his role. He quirked a brow, no idea what she meant, but amused all the same. "Crap, he saw me," she said. An explosion sounded behind him. Izuku ran faster. He'd known Kajiro wouldn't be able to distract Kaken for long, but he'd hoped for a little more time. "Where are you?" he asked, skidding to a stop near one of the windows just as Uraraka told him the floor number. He could hear footsteps behind him. Izuku gripped the windowsill and, with no hesitation, launched himself outside. Wind settled around his shoulders again, keeping him steady in the air. Kaken followed a few seconds later. Izuku unleashed the air into a quick burst, propelling him upwards and forcing Kaken down. It wouldn't be enough to ground him, but it would buy him and Uraraka valuable time. He shot up, doing his best to ignore the popping of explosions beneath him. "Get ready to lure Ida to the window," he muttered into his earpiece. "Got it." The window was directly above him. "Now!" he yelled, launching himself up and then through the opening. Izuku dived to one side as soon as he saw Ida about to charge. Kaken, who'd managed to catch up just as he'd slipped through, wasn't as lucky. Ida spotted him too late to slow down, and Izuku watched as the two of them collided in a tangle of limbs. It was a comical sight, but he didn't let himself linger on it. "Uraraka, go!" he called over, planting his feet. He took a quick breath, and focused his quirk on the floor, tensing his legs when he felt it tremble beneath him. It was enough to be noticeable, but not enough to damage the building or rock the bomb. Ida and Kaken attempted to get up, but their predicament, combined with the tremors beneath them, kept them from finding stable footing. Uraraka, on the other hand, who had made herself float as soon as she was out of Ida's range, was unaffected and grabbed hold of the bomb while Izuku kept the two of them down. "Hero team wins." All Might's voice boomed through the fake city. "That was a dirty trick." Kaken growled as they left the changing room. He'd wiped his face dry and changed out of his costume as soon as he'd had the chance, but there was only so much he could do about his hair, leaving the blonde strands messier than usual and still a little damp. "Which part?" Izuku asked, working his legs to keep them from stiffening up. He had better control over his earth aspect now, but it still strained his muscles a little too much for his liking. "You know DMN well, what part?" The other snapped with a scowl. Izuku didn't, actually. He'd pulled a few tricks during that exercise. The water thing, Kajiro, getting Ida to take him out? He could be talking about any of the three. "I really don't," Izuku said, biting back a smile. Kaken huffed. "Watch your back, nerd," he said. "I won't go easy on you next time." Izuku raised a brow, but said nothing. He stopped by the support department on his way out to drop off the case with his hero costume and the small list of changes he wanted that he'd written down between the rest of the matches. He'd seen a few of the others do the same, all of them hovering awkwardly outside the classroom until the support course teacher had come to see what the issue was. It was normal, the man, Power Loader, had told them. Sometimes the first iteration of a hero costume didn't quite match the original vision, sometimes an idea that had seemed good at first didn't quite work out when put into practice. They usually had a few people requesting changes within the first week, some came to him on the first day, while others tried to stick it out a little longer. Izuku wasn't sure when they'd get the updated versions of their costumes back. The support course had other projects to work on as well as making adjustments to their costumes after all, but Power Loader had said it shouldn't take more than a week or two at most. Uraraka and Ida were waiting for him again when he stepped outside. Uraraka grinned when she spotted him, she was bouncing slightly with leftover adrenaline. Midoriya, hey, she said. Just dropped your costume off? Yeah. He nodded. What about you? Because he remembered her saying she wasn't entirely happy with hers but he hadn't seen her in the support department. Maybe he just missed her? She shrugged. I decided to stick with it for a few more days, then see how I feel. Besides, it's not like anything needs replacing urgently. Which was fair enough. What about you, Ida? I have no issues with my costume at present. Ida responded with a slight smile. They talked for a little longer, mostly about their first heroics class. Uraraka gleefully recounted the incident in the room where the villain team had hidden the bomb, while Ida grumbled about underhanded tactics before reluctantly conceding that their plan had been effective. The almost smile he wore was enough for them to know he'd also found the situation a little amusing. Eventually, they began the short trek to the train station, walking together in a companionable silence. I'm home. He called out as he stepped into the apartment, the door clicking shut behind him. In here. His mom called back quietly from the living room. Izuku kicked off his shoes and ventured inside, spotting her sitting on the couch with her laptop open in front of her. Is that? He trailed off, a hopeful smile tugging at his lips. Yes. His mom beamed at him. Come and say hello. Izuku didn't need telling twice. He crossed the room quickly, only just remembering to slip his bag from his back before claiming the seat next to his mom. When he looked at the screen, he saw his dad smiling back at him. Hey kiddo. Dad. I'll let you two catch up. His mom laughed softly, running a hand through his hair before standing. Izuku watched as she picked up a half-full mug from the coffee table before heading out of the room. How's school? His dad asked, drawing his attention back to the screen. Izuku grinned and began to speak. He told him about his new teachers, all pro heroes, about how they'd humored his questions and signed his notebook. He told him about the new friends he'd made, Uraraka with enough optimism to rival his own, and Ida who had been initially stern but was already slowly starting to warm up around them. We had our first practical heroics class today. He said. All Might's our teacher. All Might, huh? His dad's voice gained a teasing edge, one corner of his lip curling with a playful smirk. Dad. Izuku whined, cutting off whatever remark he'd just been about to deliver. The man held his hands up in a show of surrender. I didn't say anything, kiddo. He laughed, eyes shining with amusement. Go on then, how was your class? We were split into pairs. Izuku said, and then began explaining the activity, recounting how his own match had gone. He couldn't quite hold back his laughter when he talked about the encounter with Kaken, and how he and Uraraka had managed to take him out. His dad let out a small chuckle of his own when he described the expression on the blonde's face after he'd finally managed to untangle himself from Ida. I take it Katsuki's holding a grudge now. His dad mused. Izuku snorted, Kaken was always holding some kind of grudge, but it had been worth it. He'll get over it. He responded. Of course he'd no doubt get back at him first, but still, Kaken would get over it. I'm sure he will. His dad said in that tone of voice that told Izuku he knew exactly what he'd just been thinking. Izuku merely flashed him a small smile. Has anything else exciting happened? Not yet. Izuku shook his head. But we're going on a field trip soon, so that should be fun. He briefly remembered how Aizawa-sensei had reacted to one of them describing heroics as fun, and only just managed to restrain a quick shudder. They talked until his dad eventually had to hang up. Izuku ate dinner with his mom and went to bed that night eagerly looking forward to the upcoming field trip. He wondered what they'd be doing. He hit the water hard. The impact sent a brief flash of pain through his shoulder and forced some of the air from his lungs. He flailed as he tried to right himself, eyes stinging as he looked around to gain his bearings. There had been no warning, just a sudden blanket of darkness, the lack of ground beneath his feet, and then he was falling into the water below. Villains. Teleporting villains. Izuku had known UA would be tough, but he hadn't expected to be dealing with real villains this early. None of them had. A flash of movement caught his attention and Izuku turned to see another villain swimming right towards him. He briefly considered trying to swim away, but he could tell it wouldn't do him much good. The villain had already got too close before Izuku had seen him, and he was swimming way too fast for Izuku to be able to outpace him. He braced himself as well as he could, hands flexing as he prepared to blast off a quick burst of water. It probably wouldn't do much, but it was the only aspect of his quirk that he could use right now. Kajiro was harder to control underwater, and his eyes stung too much to use his light. The villain was almost upon him when he suddenly veered sharply off course, a green blur slamming against his side. Izuku blinked. Azui stared back. "Thanks." Izuku choked out as soon as they made it onto the boat, his voice sounding raspy as he heaved in deep lungfuls of air. He'd been under the water longer than he'd thought. "You're welcome." Azui responded before ducking inside the boat. She returned a moment later with a towel which she handed to him. Izuku wiped his face and made a brief attempt at drying his hair, not that it really did much. Kaken would probably laugh when he found out exactly where he'd been dropped. "Did you see how many there were?" he asked, setting the towel to one side and wringing out his gym shirt. He hadn't had his costume back from the support department yet. Azui shook her head. "I saw a few, but I didn't have time to count," she said with a small ribbit. Izuku nodded thoughtfully and peered over the side of the boat. He could see a few villains staring back at him from the water. He was pretty sure there would be some more on the other side, maybe even a few still lurking beneath. They were most likely preparing for an ambush, which prompted another thought he was quick to share. "They don't know our quirks," he muttered. Azui had a small glint in her eye that indicated she'd come to the same realization. He glanced back over the edge, judging the distance between them and the shore. "You look like you have a plan," she said. Izuku huffed out a quiet laugh. "It's nothing too exciting," he said, turning his head to meet her eyes. "But I should be able to get us back to dry land without going back in the water if you don't mind watching my back." Because they didn't know the villain's quirks either, and, while Izuku was confident he'd be able to fly them out fairly easily, there was still a chance that the villains would attempt to blast them out of the air. Azui paused for a moment to glance down at the water herself, her answer following only a few seconds later. "Let's do it." The landing was a little rough. Izuku was good at flying, but he wasn't used to doing it while carrying someone else, but they made it. The water villains hadn't followed them yet, but Izuku knew better than to assume they wouldn't. Azui, no, Tsu, she'd insisted he call her, seemed to share his caution because he'd seen her turn around to keep an eye on the water while he scanned the area in front of them. There was a group of villains up ahead, far enough that the two of them probably wouldn't be noticed if they got out of there quick enough. From what Izuku could see, they were all focused on a singular target. "Aizawa-sensei. We should regroup with the others," Tsu said quietly from behind him. "Yeah," he agreed. A part of him wanted to help Aizawa-sensei, but he wasn't sure how much good it would really do. There were a lot of villains, and neither of them had much combat experience. It would be smarter to track down the rest of their class, to regroup and come up with some kind of strategy together. Besides, Aizawa-sensei seemed to be holding his own for the moment. Izuku knew it wouldn't last, but he reasoned that if they could find the others quick enough, then they'd be able to come back and help slim the group's numbers down, ease some of the pressure. He hated it, but they didn't have much choice. Just as they were about to move, one of the villains turned and spotted them. Izuku felt the breath stutter in his lungs. A larger villain started lumbering towards them a few seconds later, the one with the bird face and exposed brain. Izuku felt himself shift into a more combat-ready stance almost without thinking about it, shoulders going slack, hands flexing, legs tensing. It seemed they'd be fighting after all. Great. The rest of the day was a blur of non-stop moving and fighting until some of the other UA teachers had arrived, forcing most of the villains to retreat while the rest were captured and hauled off to the police officers who hadn't been far behind. There was a brief lull as they were checked over by medics and questioned by the police. A few of them had grumbled about it, mostly Kaken, but they were all too tired to offer much resistance. Thankfully, they'd all got off pretty light, bruises, mild sprains, plus a few signs of quirk exhaustion, but nothing too serious, at least, not among the students. Aizawa-sensei and 13 hadn't been so lucky. It wasn't long before they were herded onto the bus they'd arrived in. They made a quick stop back at the main campus to change out of their hero costumes, gym uniform, in Izuku's case, and gather their things before they were instructed to get back on the bus, the staff deciding it would be safer to drive them all home one by one instead of letting them take their normal routes. It was a smart decision, especially since the adrenaline had started fading once they'd got moving again. When he got home, Izuku only had enough energy left to mutter a brief explanation to his mom before stumbling off to his room for a nap. The day had certainly been hectic to say the least. The phone call came in the middle of a staff meeting. Inko hadn't been expecting one, but she had been quick to flash her coworkers a sheepish smile and step outside the briefing room to answer when she saw the contact she'd saved for Izuku's school on the screen. The phone slipped through her fingers only a mere few seconds after she'd pressed it to her ear. Villains. UA. Izuku. Her back thudded against the wall, those 3 words ricocheting around her mind as the panic began to set in. Her breathing turned ragged as her thoughts churned out different worst-case scenarios. Her heart pounded in her chest. She tilted her head to stare at the clock at the end of the hallway, watched the hands move as she willed her breathing to settle, waited for the panic to fade. It took a full 2 minutes. Her coworkers were silent when she stumbled back into the meeting room to grab her things. She did her best to pretend she hadn't been 3 seconds away from a full-blown panic attack, but, considering no one attempted to stop her, she must not have been doing a very good job of it. She barely managed to remember to retrieve her phone from the floor as she walked back out the room. The ride back to the apartment was quiet. Inko wasn't up to holding a conversation and the taxi driver made no attempts to break the silence either, even going so far as to switch the radio off when he noticed her sullen mood. A part of her was tempted to head to UA, to try to meet the bus when it arrived. But she didn't. The person she'd spoken to on the phone had been firm when they said the students would be dropped off at their homes and had sent a follow-up message. Once the call was cut with the same information written in text form, likely realizing that some parents would be too shaken up by the call itself to commit anything to memory. If Inko were to show up at the school, there was no guarantee that she'd arrive before the bus, and even if she did, she'd probably only be in the way. It was only that silent understanding that had her directing the driver to her apartment instead. The same 3 words from earlier looping continuously in her mind. Villains. UA. Izuku. She didn't even realize they'd arrived until she heard the car radio click back on. She glanced up and saw the driver's eyes staring back at her in the rearview mirror, judgment-free in that way only taxi drivers seem to manage. She muttered out an apology and a thank you in the same breath, passing the man's payment through the gap between the seats before getting out. Villains. UA. Izuku. The walk up the steps and to the door seemed to take almost twice as long as it usually did, and Inko was relieved that she'd managed to avoid bumping into any of the neighbors. She usually enjoyed stopping for a quick chat with the people they shared a floor with, but right now she wasn't sure if she'd be able to handle it without breaking down again. Villains. UA. Izuku. The apartment was quiet, empty. Izuku wasn't back yet. A small part of Inko was thankful. It gave her time to process, time to compose herself and calm down. Because Izuku shouldn't have to deal with her panic, not after the day he'd had. But the longer it took for the bus to arrive, the harder it got for her to stay calm. Logically, she knew that there were other people in Izuku's class, that the bus would have to make multiple stops before it was his turn. But logic meant very little in the face of a mother's worry. And despite her best efforts, the questions wouldn't stop flooding her mind. Was he okay? Was he hurt? Who attacked them? Why did they attack them? She could make a few guesses if she thought about it for long enough. She didn't know if Izuku was hurt, but she could at least assume he wasn't hurt too badly since the hospital hadn't been mentioned once, either during the phone call or in the follow-up message. And, well, it wasn't too hard to come up with reasons for why villains would decide to attack a group of hero students. It wasn't a comforting thought. Time slipped away from her for a while, and so it felt like she'd been waiting for hours when she finally heard Izuku's key in the door. The relief she felt when she saw him step into the room was almost enough to knock her off her feet, and Inko found herself releasing a breath she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. She swept a careful gaze over him when he drew nearer. There were a few bruises on his arms and one on the side of his face, but, thankfully, there were no signs of a more serious injury, no limp, no shallow breaths, nothing. He tried to provide an explanation for what happened, but his words came out quiet and half-slurred with exhaustion. Inko listened as best as she could, catching a few words here and there: villains, portal, water, brain. She couldn't make much sense of it. She watched as he stumbled off to his room, the tiredness setting in quickly now that he was home. A part of her wanted to pull him into a hug and not let go for a long time, but she knew there would be time for that later, when he'd had time to rest. When she poked her head around his door a few hours later to check on him, Izuku was still fast asleep. And despite the seriousness of what had happened earlier in the day, she found herself smiling at the sight. She shut the door quietly, deciding to let him sleep for a little while longer. Sleep didn't come easy that night. She tossed and turned for a couple of hours before she was able to convince herself that Izuku was fine, that it was safe to close her eyes. But even after that, what little sleep she managed was far from restful, her mind tormenting her with all the different worst-case scenarios she'd tried not to think about earlier. Izuku hurt. Izuku taken. Izuku dead. A particularly harsh nightmare woke her up a little after 4 in the morning, one that had her stumbling out of her room and across the hall. She quietly peered into Izuku's room, staring at his face, relaxed in sleep, until she could convince herself that he was okay, that her dream hadn't been real. Inko went back to bed, but she didn't go back to sleep that night. Her body felt heavy that morning while she waited for the coffee machine to finish. She usually preferred tea. The caffeine always seemed to set in slower, making the process of waking up feel more gradual, more natural. But, with how little sleep she'd managed during the night, she'd found herself turning to Hisashi's preference instead. Hisashi, right, she still had to call him. There wasn't much he could really do from another country, but Izuku was his son too, he deserved to know what happened. She sighed as she picked up her mug, adding a splash of milk and a tiny amount of sugar. She found herself thankful, in that moment, that she'd managed to pull herself together enough the day before, while she was waiting for Izuku to come home, to send an email to work informing them about what had happened. Her boss had responded 20 minutes later, firmly instructing her to take the next 2 days off. She was glad for it now, especially after she'd checked her phone this morning to find a notice from Izuku's school informing her that the students would be given a couple of days off while the staff conducted their own internal investigation. It brought Inko some relief. She wasn't exactly eager to have Izuku out of her sight just yet. And she knew how that must sound, but Inko was a worrier by nature. She'd worried the first time he skinned his knee on the playground, she'd worried about how Hisashi's move might have affected him, she'd worried when Izuku's quirk had manifested. Through all 6 of those long years, she'd worried when she realized his desire to become a pro-hero was far more serious than a simple childhood dream. She'd learned to handle it over the years, learned the difference between the right amount of parental concern and the flash of anxiety that left her mind reeling. She still occasionally felt that brief flash of panic when she thought of Izuku getting hurt, but she'd eased up over time. Even so, heroics was a dangerous business to be in and, while Inko would never dare to get in the way of Izuku's dreams, not when she'd seen firsthand just how much effort he was putting in to make them real, she'd thought she'd have more time to brace herself for the day her son started dealing with villains. So yes, she was grateful to have a couple of days off. It would give her enough time to make sure Izuku was alright and, hopefully, enough time to ease her worries back to a more reasonable level. She heard Izuku's door creak open and quickly refocused on her coffee, taking a small sip as the ball of tension in her chest finally started to uncoil. Things were a little awkward that morning. Inko hadn't been sure whether or not it was too early to bring up yesterday's events, and Izuku had seemed equally hesitant as he'd poured milk over his cereal. They ate breakfast in silence, with Inko drinking a second mug of coffee just to be sure while Izuku sipped orange juice from a glass. Izuku darted off to his room once he'd finished. A part of Inko had urged her to stop him, to try to bring up what happened, not for a full conversation, if he wasn't ready, just to check how he was feeling, but she didn't. The attack had only been yesterday, and Izuku had been right in the middle of it, so it probably wasn't wise to start poking just yet. They had a couple of days before they'd be expected to return to their usual routines. Inko would be patient for now. Instead of chasing after Izuku, she stayed in her seat and slowly drank her second coffee as she listened to the radio. She'd spent a few extra minutes trying to find a music station she liked, not in the mood to listen to the news today. She hummed along with the song that was currently playing, her concerns fading into the background momentarily. She placed her mug in the sink once she'd finished, scooping her phone from the counter before stepping into the living room. She needed to call Hisashi. The phone rang for a while, with Hisashi only picking up just as it was about to cut to the answer machine. Inko? His voice was a little tired, as though he'd just got back from work. Inko wasn't sure whether that should make her feel better or worse about what she was going to tell him. It's early there, isn't it? Is everything all right? We're okay. Inko reassured him. She knew it wouldn't do much to lessen the impact. Hisashi wasn't as much of a worrier as she was, but knowing that their son had been involved in a villain attack was exactly the kind of thing that would have him boarding the next flight to Japan, but she knew their well-being would be the main thing he cared about. There's been a situation. She told him what she knew, making sure to keep her voice calm, because he really would be on the next flight if he thought she was struggling, and leaving out the details about her own initial reaction, not ready to talk about that yet. It took a longer stretch of time to convince him that they truly were fine before he stopped asking, though he did bring up the idea of coming over for a few days when his work settled down. Inko agreed, partially because it wasn't the frantic travel plans of a scared husband and father, though that must have had some influence over the decision, and partially because it would be nice to see him in person again. She ended the phone call feeling much lighter than she had when she first got up, and settled down not long afterwards to catch up with one of the shows she recorded while she was at work. She could hear laughter coming from Izuku's room, most likely talking to one of his friends. And Inko felt relieved as she realized that the earlier tension had already started to fade for both of them. They were given the all-clear to return to school a couple of days later. As he walked through the hallways to the 1A classroom, Izuku couldn't help but notice just how normal it felt. Some of the teachers had been patrolling the halls more than usual, and a number of other students, likely recognizing which class he belonged to, had stared as he passed them, but other than that everything felt strangely calm. He shouldn't be surprised, really. Every school had some kind of plan in place for villain attacks. UA was no different in that regard. If anything, the fact that UA functioned as a hero school could only mean that their villain attack protocols were even more extensive. And in this case, it probably helped that the attack occurred at an off-site location, instead of the main building, less people at risk, less panic to subdue. Of course, most of the teachers being pro-heroes likely contributed too, Izuku considered, knowing that there was someone just a few doors down who would know what to do in a crisis went a long way to soothing people's fears. Still, that didn't make the calmness feel any less strange, and Izuku found his eyes sweeping the hallways more than usual as he walked. The whole class was a little subdued that morning. Though that was hardly a surprise. The couple of days off they'd been given following the USJ incident had helped a little, but it wasn't enough to get over the event completely. Sure, they'd been able to talk and laugh together over the phone and in the small collection of group chats that they'd already started making, distracting each other from the things they weren't ready to talk about. But that was all it had been, a distraction. Being back on UA grounds brought it all back. The absence of their homeroom teacher in particular was a heavy reminder. Even Kaken was quieter than usual. The bell rang, and the few mumbled conversations that they'd managed fell silent. Izuku knew he wasn't the only one watching the door, waiting to see which teacher they'd be getting today. It was a surprise for all of them when the person who walked through the door was Aizawa-sensei, clearly still injured, bandaged, but alive. Homeroom passed relatively normally once their collective shock had worn off. A couple of them had expressed concerns about Aizawa-sensei being back so soon, but the man had been quick to shut that particular topic down before making the morning announcements. He informed them that 13 had survived and was currently in recovery. Izuku saw Uraraka sigh in relief out of the corner of his eye. Right, he remembered her saying that 13 was one of the heroes she admired. A couple of them interrupted when it was announced that the sports festival would still be going ahead, but Aizawa-sensei's lack of annoyance, at least, he didn't sound annoyed, made it clear that he'd expected some kind of outburst. The reasoning he gave did make sense, Izuku admitted to himself in his head. UA wanted to project a strong front after the attack, wanted to reassure people that everything was under control, something which would be significantly harder if they cancelled one of their most public events. With that in mind, UA understands that some of you may have reservations about being under the spotlight so soon. Aizawa-sensei said once they'd settled back down. If any of you wish not to take part, UA will respect that. You don't need to decide now, take some time to think it over. The rest of the announcements were more mundane. Reminders to check with their teachers for any assignments they might have missed due to the recent incident, permission to request access to use one of the training areas after school if they wanted to get some extra practice in before the festival, among others. He left them to it after that, sitting down at his desk as they slowly returned to their conversations. The mood was a little lighter than it had been when they'd first entered the room. It wasn't until they started getting ready for their next class that Aizawa-sensei spoke up again. "There's one more thing you should all be aware of," he said, waiting until they were all looking at him before he continued. "I'm sure I don't need to explain to you that what happened at the USJ was in no way intentional. While it's true that you will at some point be expected to participate in field exercises, it should not have happened this early." Even with the bandages covering his face, Izuku knew the man was carefully assessing all of them. For those of you who aren't aware, UA has a licensed counselor if you want to talk to someone. It's not mandatory, but the option is there if you need it. There's no hidden test here, it won't reflect poorly on you if that's the kind of help you need. There was something knowing about the way he said it, as though he'd had to give that piece of advice and reassurance countless times. He probably had, Izuku mused to himself. Villain attacks were nerve-wracking at the best of times even for the heroes responsible for dealing with them, especially if they were caught off guard. Seemingly out of things to say, Aizawa-sensei waved them off with a tired sigh. Izuku watched him for a few more brief seconds before turning to follow Uraraka and Ida out of the room. Other than a brief scuffle at lunch between Kaken and one of the students from the other heroics class, the rest of the day was relatively peaceful. Of course, there were more stares and a few mutters that followed them in the halls, but nothing really worth mentioning happened. Izuku stopped by the teacher's lounge at the end of the day to request access to one of the training areas, idly taking note of Tsu and some of their other classmates also gathered outside the door. This could be interesting.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.